will connect both like the curricular stuff, health dimensions, and the scholarship. Today, we found out that Years, yeah.
Just like they kept saying on TV.
Yeah.
Testing.
Oh, yeah.
Testing.
Yeah. was like,
Hi, everybody. Is it on? Okay. Hi, everybody. We're just setting up, but while we're waiting, I just want to point you in the direction of some of these posters that we've got up. We have local artists here, Wang and Truong, who have done some wonderful paintings on themes related to the Sawyer seminar. So when you have time, if you could take a look and see how artists represent some of the ideas that we're dealing with, anti-Asian hate, anti-immigrant sentiment, and how that plays out in the creative realm. So please take a look at some of the work that's being done by our Newark area artists. And I will turn it over to Jamie Liu very soon.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. So thank you all for being here on this really busy day, and welcome to the second half of the Sawyer seminar on Asian Americans. I wanted to thank Sarah Dunst, Bernard Lombardi, and Mi-Hun Yoon for all of their help in making this event happen, and to Belinda, Sean, and Cornell for spearheading the seminar today. In particular, thanks to Cornell Chang, who's really spearheaded this particular seminar on Asian American communities. So my name is Jamie Liu. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers-Newark. I'm also co-director of Global Urban Studies, PhD program in urban systems with Professor Mara Sidney of political science. I have the distinct honor of introducing the speakers for the panel today, Finding Common Ground, the Promises and Perils of Immigrant and Interracial Organizing. So in many ways, thanks really to Catherine and May this morning, we really have, it's a perfect seg actually into the multiracial coalition building work and the kinds of empirical work and ground up social movement and activism work on the ground that we're doing. So the panelists here today will explore how social movement and community organizing efforts for APA communities have resisted racial violence and systemic social inequality throughout the US history. Using key historical events, social movements, policies, political and racial theories, and contemporary activism on the ground, the speakers will examine how APA communities have built and continue to build important multiracial coalition and alliance building across racial, ethnic, and immigrant lines to fight for social justice. So it may be a lofty goal here today, but it is all of our hope on the panelists and myself that through this dialogue, we not only learn from our past and these important works that you're going to hear today, but that perhaps through this dialogue we can forge a new path of really sort of examining some of the messy and complex sort of ways that we can explore political and social possibilities across racial solidarities that inform not only research and theories, but also practice and activism on the ground. And that's in the spirit of course, Rutgers-Newark. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. I'm going to start with Ellen, I think, in this direction. Dr. Ellen Wu is Associate Professor of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. She's the author of award-winning book, The Color of Success, Asian Americans and the Origins of the Modern Minority. Her research has been supported with fellowships from the Ford Foundation and National Endowment for the Humanities. She's currently working on her second book, Overrepresented, The Surprising History of Asian Americans and Racial Justice, a new story about diversity, data, and democracy in the United States. The title of her talk will be The First Asian American Influencers, which actually trace the history of the communities and affirmative action. Our next speaker is Deepa Iyer. She's a writer, a lawyer, strategist, facilitator, whose areas of expertise include the post-9/11 America experiences of South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh immigrants. She's currently the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at Building Movement Project, where she supports nonprofits and individuals engaged in transformative movements for progressive social change. Iyer's first book, Re-to-Sing America, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh immigrants shape our multiracial futures, received a 2016 American Book Award, and she hosts a podcast called Solidarity Is, to explore solidarity practices around the country. The title of her talk is Asian American Solidarity Stories, 9/11 and COVID. Our next speaker is Diane Wong, Dr. Diane Wong, and she's an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers-University, Newark. She's an affiliate faculty of Global Urban Studies, American Studies, and Women's and Gender Studies. Her current book project, You Can't Evict a Movement, Intergenerational Activism and Housing Justice in New York City, combines ethnography, participatory mapping, archival research, and augmented reality and oral history interviews to examine intergenerational resistance to gentrification in Manhattan, Chinatown. The title of her talk is Asian American Abolitionist Counter Stories for Black Liberation. Our last and not least speaker is Dr. Vivian Truong. She's an assistant professor of history at Swarthmore College. Her book project, Policing and the Construction of Asian America, examines Asian American and multiracial movements against police violence in New York City in the late 20th century. She's a community engaged scholar whose areas of research and teaching include Asian American, urban, and social movement history. She coordinates a public history project preserving the archives of the grassroots organization CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, which is formerly known as the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, where she also serves on the board of directors. The title of her talk, Rethinking Asian American Movement History and the Carceral State. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ellen.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for that warm introduction, and for all of you for coming out today. I'm really honored to be here. And I want to especially thank Jamie Liu, Cornell Chang, for organizing, Ferdy, Sarah, and Mihan for doing all the behind-the-scenes logistics. Okay, so I'm just going to dive in and tell you a little bit about what I'm calling the first Asian American influencers. And this is research from my book in progress right now about the history of Asian Americans and racial justice. And so I do have slides, and we're going to have, okay, I'll just, oh, can I, okay, great. Okay, so I guess we can skip the thank you slide and go to the next slide after that. So, the next slide after that. Okay, I'm sure most of you know Asian Americans have become the poster children for opposition to affirmative action. I see this as an ironic turn of events when we consider that Asian Americans were some of Asian affirmative action's very earliest architects. Next slide. In fact, a number of Asian American influencers helped to launch affirmative action in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s by setting bones of the policy infrastructure. Now, at the time, their contributions appeared modest and of secondary importance, but these influencers' efforts had far-reaching consequences for minority rights that would come to matter for everyone with a stake in the connections between race and opportunity. Next slide. Okay, so let's set the stage. We'll dial back to the 1930s and 40s, and it's at this time there's an emergence of two key turning points in the history of racial justice. The first is that the concept of the quote-unquote minority takes hold among U.S. liberals, that is social scientists, government officials, community leaders, and they conceive of a salient dividing line, splitting society into the majority, what we might call the WASPs, and then minorities, with the existence of minorities posing an urgent problem. So liberals at the time conceived of minorities as being people who are physically and culturally distinctive and also targeted by wrongful prejudice and discrimination. Liberals championed moral persuasion and robust government intervention to eliminate these discriminatory barriers. Their goal was to fully assimilate and integrate the so-called minorities. Now, the second turning point was the Black freedom movement, how it gained momentum in the 30s and 40s and really was the driving force in redefining what we can think of as rights from the middle of the 20th century onward. So here we can bring in a concept that historians use, the rights revolution, which is really a shift in thinking about rights from equality of opportunity to an equality of result for minorities. So we might think of that as an integrated military, workplaces, housing, and schools. Next slide. So underlying this question of minority this notion is a really implicit, but it's a really critical, crucial question. Who counts as a bona fide minority? That is, which groups are sufficiently beleaguered or burdened? Which groups can make legitimate and persuasive claims to government intervention and compensatory or reparative justice? Now, I think the answer was neither self-evident nor agreed upon. Certainly, Black Americans were the primary focus for federal government's minority right efforts, but Black folks' calls for rights and equal opportunities were actually capacious enough to benefit other groups. And so, for Asian Americans, the advent of minority rights then presented an opening, but also a challenge or a problem. And that is, next slide please, how to prove that they're a beleaguered minority, right? That they ought to be included in this minority rights revolution. Okay, so let's go to the 10 months leading up to World War II. And we have this very important moment when Black labor organizer A. Philip Randolph calls for a march on Washington to desegregate the military and defense industries. Next slide. This pressure leads President Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802 in June 1941, and that order bans race, creed, color, or national origin discrimination in government agencies, companies, and unions who have contracted for defense work. This executive order convenes the Committee on Fair Employment Practice, FEPC for short. I'll refer to this a lot, FEPC, and that is to oversee this policy and investigate complaints of employment discrimination. Slide. In October 1941, the FEPC holds policy hearings, public hearings in Los Angeles. And at that time, the Japanese American Citizens League, which is this fledgling social welfare proto-political organization founded by NISE, that is US-born children of Japanese immigrants. I'll call them JACL for short. You go that one, yeah. JACL appears at these hearings, and they send actually their 26-year-old, Mike Masaoka, who is the young man on the left of the photo, the very left. He's their national secretary. They send to give testimony at these LA hearings. It's the very first time the JCL gives federal testimony. And Masaoka, testifies on anti-Japanese American discrimination in employment, and he says, "We Japanese Americans ask for the right to live, to earn a living on an equal basis with other Americans, to serve our country in the defense industry." It's actually a very successful testimony. This JACL testimony leads to trade unions and certain companies pledging to eliminate anti-Japanese bias. And FEPC commits to monitoring this work. It is real progress, but of course that is short-circuited when just a few weeks later, the bombing of Pearl Harbor happens, and that leads to the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans. But I'll note that once Japanese Americans started to leave the camps, in fact, to fill a labor shortage, in large part, some of them did turn to FEPC for help when they encountered discrimination during the war. So the long-term importance of the FEPC testimony and these cases for Japanese Americans is that it laid conceptual groundwork for the government to recognize Japanese Americans as a beleaguered minority. Next slide. So if we fast forward to the end of the war, 1946, this is when the Japanese American Citizens League regroups and launches a dedicated policy agenda for Japanese American rights. It's led by Mike Masaoka, the young man I showed you, and I really consider him to be the first Asian American influencer. What's so interesting about him, I think, and so kind of weird, is that actually a lot of Japanese Americans hated him by this time. He had been the one leading the call to cooperate with federal authorities during World War II and that incarceration moment. He was the one out there, and some of his buddies, championing military service among Japanese Americans to prove that they were 100% loyal to the United States. So, as you can imagine, this was a hugely controversial position to take during and after the war. And so he was really hated for decades and despised by many people as a sellout and as a government collaborator. But the argument I actually want to make is that it's this very collaboration with the government that provides Masaoka and Japanese American Citizens League leaders with a type of political capital, a know-how that allows them to lay what they call pipelines to the establishment. And it turns out that Masaoka becomes a really talented young political strategist. In this photo, so this is actually an article from Reader's Digest that celebrated him as Washington's most successful lobbyist by the late 40s. And in the photograph, it's his wife, Etsu Mineta Masaoka. She does not get a lot of recognition, but they were basically like business partners. And the two of them were actually among the very first people to register as professional lobbyists once Congress mandated that in 1946. And so the Masaokas, the JCL, they build this case that of Japanese Americans as a beleaguered minority. Next slide. In 1947, previous slide. Yeah, in 1947, President Truman convenes a President's Committee on Civil Rights, and they have national hearings. Masaoka testifies for JCL. He provides a lot of data. He shows that Japanese American immigrants were shut out of over 100 occupational fields because they were racially ineligible to become citizenship. And he makes the argument that Japanese Americans deserve rights and compensation, compensatory justice. So they call for very specific compensation, reparations for their wartime losses, naturalization and immigration rights, and halting deportation of Japanese immigrants. So the final report issued by this committee in 1947 endorses JACL's policy agenda, acknowledging Japanese Americans as a beleaguered minority, and Congress actually does grant some token reparations and naturalization and immigration rights by the 1950s. Next slide. I also want to mention that Japanese American Citizens League also advocated for minority rights more broadly. Their advocacy is actually really key to understanding how minority rights expanded to include non-Black groups, including what were called Orientals at the time. And I really want to stress that this expansion was not inevitable, right? It had to happen through this advocacy. And so the JCL was very consistent and sincere supporter of the Black freedom movement at this time, really practicing a solidarity with anti-racist liberal left activists and organizations. Here's just a screenshot. This is JCL testimony before Congress on anti-lynching laws in the late 1940s. But JCL supported all kinds of legislation for housing and school desegregation, voting rights, getting rid of the filibuster, and workplace discrimination protection. So it's really a kind of a solidarity lobbying that was mutually beneficial. It was an opportunity for JCL to support Black communities, but it was also an opportunity for Japanese Americans to argue that they ought to get state recognition as a beleaguered minority, and that Japanese Americans too were burdened by these forms of white supremacy. So here he actually mentions all the anti-Japanese hate and violence that occurs as Japanese Americans return home to California after the war. Okay, next slide. So I'm gonna try to stick to my 15 minutes. So the next example is the ongoing campaign of the Black Freedom Movement for a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, between the 40s and the 60s. Now, the original FEPC was only intended for the wartime, but JCL and others invested heavily in this Black-led campaign to make FEPC a permanent federal agency with robust enforcement authority and broad coverage. So Masaoka testifies at least 4 times before Congress, and JCL does a lot of parallel lobbying at the state and local level. I want to mention another influencer. Her name was Ina Sugihara. It's a grainy photo, but you can see her in the picture on the right. This is from the Chicago Defender. She was a Nisei Japanese American activist, like a real firecracker, a co-founder of the New York chapter of the Congress for Racial Equality, which is the national civil rights organization spearheading nonviolent direct action to thwart segregation. She's a co-founder during World War II of the New York City chapter of JACL. It's the first interracial chapter of JACL. And they joined a citywide coalition to save FEPC. Sugihara did a lot of writing. She contributed to The Crisis, which was the NAACP's official magazine. Here is her article from 1945, Our Stake in a Permanent FEPC, where she says, the fate of each minority depends upon the extent of justice given all other groups. So she's really advocating that everyone joins together to support a permanent FEPC. Next slide. Between 1945 and 1964, there were over 100 FEPC bills introduced in Congress, and all of them failed to pass, actually. But at the state level, there was a lot more success, and JCL supported those campaigns in like California, Utah, Colorado, Illinois, and 29 states actually passed FEPC bills. California in 1959, also municipalities like San Francisco. And there's not only Japanese Americans, but Chinese and Filipinx people who are supporting these efforts. So I want to stress that even though the legislation failed at the national level, the biggest win of this mobilization for FEPC was the coalition itself. That leads to the establishment of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights in 1952, which is the most effective interracial interfaith umbrella lobbying vehicle for labor and civil rights groups at mid-century. JACL is the only Asian American co-founding member of the Leadership Conference. Next slide. So the perennial failure of this FEPC legislation forces liberals to kind of reroute what they're doing, and they turn from like targeting Congress to thinking about administrative policy experiments, like you don't have, things like where you don't have to pass a law to address employment discrimination. And this leads to patchwork approaches in the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy administrations toward the goal of equal employment opportunity. And this is where we start to see the early stirrings of affirmative action. This is just one example of JCL testifying before the first Truman's President's Committee on Government Contract Compliance. Sounds very boring, but this is what they're doing. And the goal here is to really, try to, again, accomplish a workplace desegregation. But what I want to highlight here is that bureaucrats have to decide which groups are the minorities that deserve to be included in these efforts. Next slide. So for Asian Americans, luckily, they have like a bureaucratic insider to kind of speak up for their interests. So this is the final influencer I'm going to introduce. His name was John Yoshino, also a Nisei Japanese American, a behind-the-scenes civil rights activist. So in 1961, just for example, he helped to desegregate restaurants in along Route 40, which is in Maryland. There were a bunch of restaurants there that would not let Black people eat. And that was very embarrassing to the United States, because when African diplomats would come in and they couldn't get a hamburger, this really embarrassed the world. So this was, he was part of the team that helped to convince these restaurants to serve Black people. Now, next slide. So John Yoshino was on the staff of Eisenhower's President's Committee on Government Contracts and Kennedy's President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. And the charge of these two executive communities was to facilitate non-discrimination compliance by employers who contracted or subcontracted with federal agencies. So they didn't have a lot of power. They didn't have enforcement powers. They only had powers of suggestion. So he's here in the photo. This is a story that ran the Black newspapers, when he got this appointment on staff. Now, I should mention Yoshino's responsibilities were not Oriental, as they were called, Oriental specific, but because he was so familiar with Japanese Americans, he was actually a member of the JCL Chicago, that positioned him as an advocate for Asian Americans, and he nudges these committees to collect data on Japanese Americans and eventually on Orientals. At the same time, they're collecting employment information about Black people and other minority groups. All this data is then used to prove that Japanese Americans and then Orientals have employment troubles and that they are beleaguered minorities. So one of the other, I think, important interventions that Yoshino helps with, and this is why I think he's an influencer, is this question for these committees. How do you diagnose and measure workplace discrimination? How do you even prove that problem exists, and then how do you fix it? And so what they did was draw on strategies by Black activists. Yoshino and his colleagues, what they started to do is firm up the use of proportionality logic and statistical data. So what I mean by that is thinking about how the racial makeup of a particular organization, let's say a workplace or a university, how that makeup ought to mirror the percentages of in the community as a whole, if you look at the demographic breakdown. And so when you have the numbers, then you can see if some groups are underutilized, is what they call it, or underrepresented, and that's a red flag, and then a trigger for government interventions. So, okay, these administrative experiments by Yoshino and his colleagues then help to crystallize the foundational logics that would become the linchpins of affirmative action. So it's rising expectations of government intervention to fix racial discrimination. It's proportionality logic to diagnose and measure discrimination. And it's also quantifiable metrics, data and hard numbers. And this is an issue today, right? Especially within Asian American communities. And those became far-reaching and very normative assumptions when it came to minority rights and affirmative action policy. And so this is why I consider these folks and some others the first Asian American influencers. And the last thing I just want to mention is, the work that they did also had an unintended outcome. And if we fast forward to today, a common description of Asian Americans is that they're overrepresented. And here's just the dictionary definition: represented excessively, proportion higher than average. And then my last final slide. And really that has generated a whole new set of problems for minority rights and affirmative action efforts. So I will stop there. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am really grateful to everyone who put this seminar together, and I'm happy to be here with all these folks whom I admire and have known about and read about, so appreciate the invitation to attend. Okay, hopefully this will work. So I wanted to just start off actually, before I tell you what I'm talking about, just to be clear about my point of entry into this conversation. I don't think it's still working. Thank you, sorry. So I am, I'm a lawyer and someone who works in the nonprofit sector, so I'm not an academic, so a bit of an imposter up here with everyone else. But I work in an organization called the Building Movement Project, and for about 20 years have been in the nonprofit sector, working specifically with South Asian and Asian American and other immigrant communities. But our organization focuses on catalyzing social change through research, through resources and relationships. And on the next slide, the specific project that I work on is related to solidarity and social movements. And so that's really going to be the focus of my conversation today. And in that vein, the specific work on solidarity that I'm going to be referencing is really related to, on the next slide, some of the work that we've been doing, particularly with Asian American communities over the last couple of years. And if you're more interested in this work, please check out www.solidaritystories.org, where we're uplifting stories and practices of Asian American communities in particular during this time, but also in the past as well. So on the next slide, here are a couple of the questions that I'm going to try to get into today, but looking forward to our conversation. So I wanted to see if we can talk a little bit about the drivers and limitations of solidarity as a concept and a practice. Also talking a little bit about what can we learn from solidarity efforts that happen in response to two major events, the post 9/11 era and the current moment that we're in right now. And then what are some emerging narratives and practices, recognizing that everything when it comes to community building, power building, and solidarity is evolving and iterative. It's not perfect and it's not complete. So what I'm going to present to you is sort of what is in motion right now. Before we get there, on the next slide, and you can just click through all of this and it'll come up slowly, thank you. This is a little bit about how we think about solidarity work in social movements in the United States at my organization. So we think a lot about what are the drivers that are pushing community members and organizations to build solidarity, and some of these have been mentioned already, so I'll quickly go through them. There's obviously the changing demographics, right? That's a driver. There's also a sense of urgency and backlash right now that a lot of communities of color are facing as a result of the power of social movements and as a result of the changing demographics. There are deeper commitments to dismantling anti-Black racism, as we saw particularly with the uprisings in 2020. So these are all drivers. At the same time, there are lots of challenges, right? There's push and pull when it comes to solidarity. Organizations tell us that they have limited time and capacity to do solidarity work when they're working in their own communities. Working in silos is often rewarded, right? Stay in your lane and do your work well. There are so many wedge politics that make it difficult for communities to build with each other. And there's a lot of lack of trust because folks are constantly dealing with cycles of crises and don't have the time to really build relationships with each other, which is obviously fundamental to solidarity practice. At the same time, we are seeing, particularly in Asian American communities, some practices around solidarity, and I'll talk about these even more as we move through and talk about the different case studies. But what we're seeing is a real focus on internal solidarity. So kind of like building our base within, and then obviously really dealing with mobilizing against dominant wedge narratives that are tearing Asian Americans apart from other communities of color. One more slide on sort of like the theory part on the next page, or the next slide. Thank you. This is how we think about transformative solidarity practices. There are 6 characteristics that often come up with solidarity practice. This is based on social movements, both in the US and around the world, particularly the Black radical tradition and indigenous movements. But what we often see when organizations and communities want to practice transformative, not transactional solidarity, that there's a real emphasis on centering the demands of affected communities. There's an emphasis on finding connections and commonalities without flattening them. There is an emphasis on co-liberation. How do we all kind of get to freedom and liberation? And there's an emphasis on co-conspiratorship instead of allyship, which really makes it clear that there's a stake, right, in terms of being connected to solidarity movements for justice. So if we kind of take a look, keeping that in mind, I wanted to talk about 2 moments or 2 eras. The first is the post 9/11 moment. As you all know, we marked the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks and the backlash just last year. And you know, when you look back over the last 2 decades, this is just a timeline that pulls up a certain types of events that occurred, not everything. But what we saw was both state violence and state violence happening in communities, particularly those who are South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh communities. So I think folks know about the bullying, the murders, the assaults that happen to community members at institutions of faith, and also know, we can go to the next slide, about the policies of profiling, special registration, arbitrary detentions, the surveillance of community members and mosques in particular, the counterterrorism programs, right, that all ran rampant through our communities. And even if you go further, you know, a lot of community members talk about how the Trump administration time really felt like a second backlash because of the Muslim ban, because of the ways in which immigrant communities were being treated and the like. So what are some of the lessons learned, right, when we look at the post 9/11 era and solidarity? And I'm more interested in sort of laying out some of the complexities. There are some bright spots too, but some of the complexities and messiness that we saw is that solidarity that's based on a constructed racial identity, as the Asian American identity is, will inevitably contain a lot of fissures and fault lines, right? So I worked at a national South Asian American organization for 10 years post 9/11, and I saw firsthand how there was distancing in many Asian American communities from what was happening to South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh communities. I think part of that is this constant sort of question that comes up around South Asians. Are we a part of the Asian American community or not? As Lavina Shankar and Rajni Shrikant wrote about a very long time ago, I think that question is still prescient now. But there was this sort of distancing around looking at state violence or even Islamophobia and seeing them as issues that affected Asian Americans, seeing them as racial justice issues, right? Instead, they were sort of seen as national security issues and in many ways compartmentalized as such. And it's not surprising then that a new coalition identity began to emerge in the post 9/11 moment, the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian identity, or known as AMEMSA. I know we're big on acronyms in the nonprofit social movement space. So that's one of the acronyms. We have also expanded it to be the MEMSA to include Black Muslim communities as well, through, again, a solidarity lens. So while there were, of course, Asian American groups like All Deaf in New York City and the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco that supported and represented South Asian and Muslim and Sikh communities, it really became clear on the next slide that what we needed was the growth of MEMSA organizations, right, that were mobilizing in our own communities, in South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh communities. And if you look at if you compare the landscape of organizations pre and post 9/11, you will see a marked difference in community building, power building organizations after 9/11. We also saw other practices of solidarity where there was a deepening of a political analysis of state violence. So one example is where there is now an understanding that what is happening to Chinese scientists and surveillance of Chinese scientists is very similar to the surveillance tactics that were used post 9/11, particularly on Muslim communities, right? So understanding the connections there. Another emerging practice that helped with solidarity was centering affected communities and their demands and narratives. So this is an image from a rally that happened to protest the Muslim ban in 2017. And one of the people that we brought to that rally is Holly Yasui, who's in the middle there. Somebody who is, she was a daughter of someone who had been incarcerated during World War II and really stepped up to show how important it was that we understand the connections between what happened during the incarceration and the Muslim ban. On the next slide, some images from a coalition in San Francisco that emerged to push back on the Joint Terrorism Task Force there and got it dismantled. A real coalition solidarity connection that was built over time, over 10 to 15 years. And on the next slide, this is an image from an organization called Vigilant Love in Los Angeles, which came together between Japanese Americans and Muslims. A lot of intergenerational work, but really youth-focused work as well. And this is an image from a pilgrimage that the group took to Manzanar. So these are examples of how the commonalities and connections are building and have been building. There's a deeper political analysis of the power of the state and what it's doing to our communities. And that has really helped in terms of solidarity practice. So the next the next time I want to look at is now, right? What is happening or what has been happening over the last couple of years when it comes to COVID and the rise in anti-Asian hate. I think all of us here know how that has been playing out in various communities. And what we're doing is actually taking a look at how community-based organizations in certain parts of the country where there was mass violence, whether it was Indianapolis, at the FedEx facility that targeted Sikh community workers, whether it was what happened in Atlanta with the spa shootings, the Philadelphia SEPTA incident, and in New York and San Francisco. We've been interviewing community advocates there to get a sense of what solidarity is looking like and what has it looked like. What are the messy parts? What are the bright spots? So a little of what we're finding. So clearly during this time, we've seen sort of this increase in community mobilization from all sectors, right? Where people are becoming more aware of what is happening in our communities. We're also seeing, on the next slide, this real focus on understanding that there has to be a solidarity and abolition base, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Diane and Vivian about this as well, when it comes to recommending solutions and policy initiatives that deal with hate violence. So this particular slide here shows some of the complexities that I think community members and groups are dealing with that we're hearing about. So what we're hearing is the importance of understanding that there are root causes of systemic violence and inequity, that interpersonal hate is based in something, right? And it's often the failure of the state over time. And so looking at root causes of violence has become a really important political analysis for many communities. At the same time, community groups are balancing the need to respond to the demands of survivors and victims and what they need to be seen, to be heard, oftentimes for an investigation to happen, right? So how are community groups balancing both understanding the root causes of systemic violence and interpersonal violence, as well as centering the demands of survivors? There is no sort of one answer to that, but that is what we hear time and again when we interview community advocates, that this is a tension that they're holding, and they're able to articulate that. What we're also seeing on the next slide are some emerging practices to respond to that tension. So what we're seeing is deep political education and base building. So a lot of community groups are going inward, recognizing that they need to focus on building out their own base, their own community members, and doing political education around the restorative justice practices that could be used, to doing education around the carceral state. There's also this real practice around meeting communities where they're at, not disposing of communities, not dismissing them if they're not on the same page politically, but actually meeting communities where they should be. And there's this real emphasis on recognizing that we need a diverse and robust ecosystem of Asian American groups. So one organization said to us, we don't work with survivors of hate violence, but what we really are happy about is that there are so many other Asian American groups that we can send survivors who come to us to, right? So needing that sort of, can you go back, sorry. And then a couple of more things. Co-learning with Black communities. This is happening a lot in community-based organizations. And seeding organizations in areas with emerging Asian populations. So these are just some of the solidarity practices that are coming about in this particular moment. So I'm going to close with just some images of solidarity that I think are important for us to think about, whether it's to disrupt the model minority myth, or on the next slide, whether it is around young people taking action to make it clear that they are building with Black communities. And on the next slide, this is an image from the memorial that happened in Atlanta on the one-year anniversary of the spa shootings there, an image by Natalie Bowie, which shows how our movements are interconnected and should be seen as such. Next slide, some resources if you are interested in more on solidarity practices that are emerging, solidaritystories.org. We do podcasts, and we have a whole sort of list, a playlist on Asian Americans in solidarity and the Asian American Racial Justice Toolkit, which was put together by grassroots Asian American groups. And that is it. So I will close there. Thank you so much, and looking forward to questions.
Maybe put it somewhere like that. Okay. We tried. Thank you all for coming out. I'm really delighted to share space this afternoon. How's it sound? Is it good? Okay. Yeah. Like this? Is this better? Great. This is honestly a dream panel, so I'm really delighted to be in conversation with everyone. My talk will cover Asian American activism around police abolition in efforts to chart emergent directions in Asian American activism studies. Next slide. So more than 50 years since the movement that birthed Asian American identity and the field of Asian American studies, the Asian American community is far more diverse than movement activists could have ever imagined. Right? The material conditions of Asian American communities and the political issues at stake have also become much more multifaceted and complex. Next slide. Today, refugees of the Vietnam War face detention and deportation under resurgent nativist policies. Next slide. Korean, Okinawan, and Filipino diasporas continue to grapple with U.S. economic and military dominance in their homelands. Next slide. Asian Americans in urban hubs like New York, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles are experiencing collective trauma from anti-Asian violence and xenophobic hate. But in the face of such cyclical violence, we've also seen the emergence of more capacious notions of community care in the form of coalitional alignment, next slide, and the redistribution of resources, expertise, and space. We've seen the formation of coast-to-coast solidarity networks, intergenerational coalitions, and the growth of mutual aid networks, from meal deliveries to childcare collectives to legal aid to Skillshares to language interpretation to eviction defense. We've seen a plethora of such examples. Right, in the last decade alone, we've seen these critical moments of community resistance, next slide, bearing movements that require us to expand how we think about Asian American politics, right, and particularly intergenerational and interracial organizing in the 21st century. So the study of Asian American activism as a field has expanded in the last 2 decades, particularly as social scientists have deployed new approaches to document Asian American electoral trends and demographic shifts. However, in building on, we're still at the slide. Thank you. But building on Diane Fujino's call to theorize the genealogy of Asian American politics beyond a liberal framework, next slide, of electoral politics, demographic trends, and hate crimes legislation, and other modes of action that seek recognition from the state, I'm interested in excavating bottom-up movements for justice that reconfigure how we think about democratic citizenship and political possibilities. So my work builds on Don Nakanishi's call for an expanded framework for understanding Asian American politics and build on 2 strands of existing scholarship. So the first is ethnographic studies of Asian American movements that are primarily historical and focused on the long 60s. And the second is social scientific studies and approaches to Asian American communities, which often focus on sort of electoral and demographic trends and actions that seek state recognition. And so while the former body of work offers a rich theorization of the revolutionary Asian American politics, its applicability to our current moment is fraught. And while the latter body of work provides a more nuanced understanding of Asian American political behavior, they're focused on the formal sphere, I argue eclipses the more radical origins and possibilities for Asian American political organizing in the current moment. Right, from abolitionist fights to decriminalize sex work in New York, next slide, to transformative organizing to remove police from schools in Madison, Wisconsin, and to anti-deportation activism in Minnesota that troubles the good immigrant narrative of belonging. There are plenty of lessons that can be learned from contemporary moments and movements that help us to re-envision a kind of Asian American activism that is not only reactive to existing systems of power, but as fugitive, interstitial, and visionary in the sense that they're forging new spaces of activation and also contesting the terrain of the political in and of itself. Right? So how we choose to narrate Asian American activism and interracial organizing today will not only shape how we understand Asian America and the nation, but what alternative futures are possible for us. Next slide. Next slide. So in the last decade, we've seen the emergence of a new iteration of abolitionist Asian American politics, challenging us to think more expansively about anti-Asian violence, right? To move beyond individual and episodic instances of violence to thinking more systemically of root causes and interconnections for long-term organizing and movement building. We've seen Asian Americans organize, next slide, in solidarity with Black communities and the formation of Asians for Black Lives chapters across the country, from the Bay Area to Twin Cities to New York and San Diego, pushing for more community-led policing and public safety initiatives. There's also a lot to learn from organizations that have long fought anti-Asian violence in all its forms without reinforcing anti-Black racism. Organizations like CAB, next slide, Organizing Asian Communities, which Professor Truong will talk more about, organizes Asian communities in New York City and has a long history of fighting anti-Asian violence in all its forms, right? From evictions to police brutality to labor rights for sex workers, undocumented workers, garment workers, street vendors, and nail salon workers. Next slide. There's Red Canary Song, which is a collective founded in the aftermath of the death of Chinese massage parlor named Song in Flushing, Queens, and they organize at their intersections of sex work, decriminalization, migrant rights, and police abolition. slide. And then there's groups like the Asian Prisoner Support Committee in Oakland and Release MMA in Minnesota, led by formerly incarcerated people who are making critical connections between mass incarceration and South Asian and Southeast Asian deportation and detention. While recent responses to the increase in anti-Asian violence have led to more hate crimes legislation and more law enforcement, many Asian Americans have actually been quick to point out that the police have a long history of perpetuating violence and criminalization and surveillance within Asian American communities, right? Against specifically poor Asian women, massage parlor workers, sex workers, domestic workers, and undocumented folks. Next slide. So in cities across the country, Asian American youth are at the forefront in the Black-led movement for police abolition, making critical connections that challenge us to reimagine notions of community care, safety, accountability, and what wholeness looks like. And so there's much to learn from Asian American youth-led organizations like, next slide, like Viet leads our Roost youth program based in Camden and Philly. And they've made critical connections between the policing of Southeast Asian youth as upheld by the school to prison to deportation pipeline to the criminalization of Black youth within these cities. Next slide, please. In the Midwest, Chicago SC Youth Rising is leading urgent conversations around the intersections of caste abolition and policing in South Asian communities. Next slide, please. On the West Coast, CID Coalition in Seattle has created transformative justice models and are actively fighting a new youth jail in the International District. Right, these Asian American youth-led groups importantly rupture the model minority logics of insularity and are building power through direct action, through media, through cultural production, through security training, mutual aid, and a variety of other tactics. The transformative work around police abolition as led by Asian American youth is supported by recent data. The next slide, please. A Judge Forward survey reveals that majorities of Asian American youth support putting entire police department budgets towards other areas such as healthcare, housing, and education. So 75% of Asian American youth support putting the entire police budget for social services. In addition, 85% of Asian American youth support the formation of a new agency of first responders that would specialize in de-escalation of violence, which includes providing mental health services and other services that would remove responsibilities from the police. And so in the aftermath of the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, we saw protesters take up the streets, right, to demand police defunding. And we saw in cities like Baltimore, divestment from Carceral Solutions, Carceral Infrastructures to redistribute these funds for housing, for mental health, food access, and other life-affirming programs. In cities like Oakland, Denver, and Minneapolis, youth took the call to defund the police as a call to remove the police from their schools and campuses. So in Madison, Wisconsin, Southeast Asian youth have really been at the forefront in the Black-led movement to disband school resource officer programs. Next slide, please. So the Freedom Youth Squad, or Freedom Inc., was founded to bring Black, Hmong, and Khmer youth in Madison, Wisconsin together to end carceral violence through education, leadership development, and reciprocal relationship building. Right. Over the years, the Freedom Youth Squad has grown to provide programs for empowerment, organizing, education, and advocacy while being committed to the understanding that Asian American solidarity must uplift the demands of, where's my alarm? So they've been at the forefront, they're understanding solidarity as work that uplifts the demands of Black communities without being a burden on Black-led organizing, right? Several years ago, Freedom Youth Squad mobilized hundreds of youth in Madison after the murder of Tony Robinson at the hands of Madison police and fought to stop a new jail from being built in Dade County. More recently, Black and Southeast Asian youth members of the Freedom Youth Squad have led the successful Police Free Schools campaign, advocating not only for the removal of the police from the Madison Metropolitan School District, but for a shift in decision-making power to youth and communities who are most impacted by institutionalized policing. And so the organizing work of Freedom Youth Squad speaks to the radical possibilities of contemporary Asian American youth activism that is in solidarity with the movement for Black lives, while building on past legacies of Asian American solidarity projects with Black communities. Next slide, please. And we're seeing different iterations of this struggle take place across the country where Asian American youth are expanding conversations around anti-Asian violence to include various forms of structural violence, especially as it relates to immigration, poverty, housing, and policing. In New York City, Asian American youth have taken up the streets of Chinatown to demand that the city scrap the $8.3 billion borough-based jail plan that would involve the construction of essentially 4 new jails across the city under the guise of closing Rikers. And as part of this plan, a high-rise jail is proposed to be, it will be built now in the heart of Chinatown, which if constructed would be the tallest jail in the country and possibly the world. At the forefront of this movement are Asian American youth involved in groups like Asian Youth Against Displacement and others. Next slide, please. Or making critical connections between mass incarceration and gentrification, right? An intergenerational cultural collective that I'm part of, called the Chinatown Art Brigade, has also been at the forefront of these conversations, drawing our attention toward the connections between art washing, displacement, and criminalization. Next slide, please. The youth members of the brigade have led a series of actions, including a convening that brought together women, queer, trans, non-binary organizers from groups like the Asian American Feminist Collective, Red Canary Song, and the Chinatown Tenants Union to discuss the role of Asian Americans in imagining abolitionist futures, what that might look like, right? There are plenty of other examples of abolitionist enactments that I encourage scholars and students here to turn towards, like these contemporary moments that push the boundaries of how we think about Asian American activism and how we write, teach, and talk about possibilities for building common ground in this moment. I think I'm at time, so I'm going to end it here. I think that's the final slide too. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so humbled to be here and echo my co-panelists' thanks for the organizers of this lawyer seminar. So my talk today is titled Rethinking Asian American Movement History in the Carceral State. So it's part of a book manuscript in progress called Policing and the Construction of Asian America, which thinks about policing as a major site of Asian American racialization in the late 20th century. So I wanted to start with one of the most well-known images in Asian American history, which was taken by the late photographer Lee during the protests against the police beating of Chinese American Peter Yu in 1975. So in it, 4 Asian American protesters link arms while others hoist banners calling for an end to police brutality and oppression. The photo has come to symbolize an alternative narrative of Asian America, one that was politically active and confronted a form of racist violence that is most commonly understood to be faced by Black and Latinx communities. But rather than framing the Peter Yu protests as an exceptional moment in Asian American history, in this presentation, I ask what motivated 10 to 20,000 Chinese immigrants to take to the streets in 1975. So how might a deeper history of police violence against Asian Americans reconfigure our understanding of Asian American racialization and multiracial coalition? So in this talk, I focus on 2 organizations active in the Asian American movement of the 1960s and 70s, Iyer and Asian Americans for Equal Employment, and I re-examine the historical context of the Yu protests to argue that police and state violence were not peripheral issues for Asian American communities, but rather they were central concerns at a time when the concept of Asian America was coming into existence. The events of the 1960s and 70s would define Asian American racialization for at least the next half century. So on one hand, the model minority was entrenched as the dominant narrative of Asian American communities. On the other hand, radical activists inspired by the Black Power and anti-war movements formed new organizations across the country, claiming the term Asian American as a new political identity against racism and imperialism. Chinatowns were a site where these contrasting images of Asian Americans collided, particularly around the issues of crime and juvenile delinquency. So my co-panelist Ellen Wu has shown how Chinatown leaders appropriated the discourse of non-delinquency in the midst of a post-war panic concerning youth crime. And sociological scholarship and popular media depicted Chinatowns as exceptional cultural environments for raising law-abiding children. And the Chinatown elite, who were represented by organizations like the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, promoted the narrative that strict gender roles and Confucian ideals of filial piety made Chinese families a model for solving the nation's youth problem. So crime was one of the primary axes on which the development of the model minority narrative really spun. And this is especially happening in the context of urban unrest in the 1960s, defining Asianness in opposition to Blackness. Tamara Knopper succinctly describes the model minority as a sociology of crime based on the idea of safe Asian Americans in contrast to dangerous African Americans. So while community leaders were upholding the non-delinquency narrative, the maintenance of this image foreclosed the possibility of actually addressing existing issues in New York City's Chinatown. In the 1970s, the median income for Chinatown families was almost 2/3 of the median income for New York City families. About a quarter of Chinatown families lived in poverty, almost double the overall New York City poverty rate. And despite the depiction of Chinatown as a neighborhood that was free of crime, gangs, intra-community violence, and policing were issues that were experienced by many of its residents. Young Asian American movement activists were driven by a commitment to serve the people, organized to meet the community's basic needs, including housing, education, healthcare, and employment. In New York City's Chinatown, serving the people also included confronting youth violence and police brutality. So one of the organizations that aimed to address the needs of the poor and working class in Chinatown was IWK, or Iyer Quen, founded in 1969. Translating to Righteous and Harmonious Fist, Iyer Quen was named after a peasant organization that led the Boxer Rebellion against foreign intervention in China at the turn of the century. Asian American movement historians have emphasized the role of IWK in organizing a free neighborhood health clinic and fighting the eviction of immigrant tenants by the Bell Telephone Company. However, policing was a primary concern since the early days of the organization. In the inaugural issue of their organizational newsletter in 1970, IWK reported that the police indiscriminately arrested Chinese youth in response to a series of stabbings and shootings affecting the neighborhood. IWK wrote, "The pigs are afraid of people getting together." They called for the people of Chinatown to get together, not as gangs fighting one another, but as a community in solidarity with other third world groups to address the roots of poverty, unemployment, war, and oppression. They named their bilingual Chinese and English newsletter "Getting Together" in the spirit of neighborhood and multiracial unity. So IWK took a confrontational stance against the state and performed a radical militancy that was most associated with the Black Power movement. So this cover page of the January 1971 issue of Getting Together depicted an intergenerational crowd of Chinatown youth and workers in paramilitary gear. They're wielding guns, meat cleavers, and spears. The crowd is trampling a group of anthropomorphic pigs dressed in police uniforms, riot gear, and businessmen's suits. And in their depiction of the police, the IWK borrowed the rhetoric of the Black Panthers and added a Chinese cultural spin to the imagery. In a play on the Chinese zodiac's Year of the Pig, the organization declared 1971 on the Gregorian calendar and 4669 on the lunar calendar to be the Year of the People, off the pig. The newsletter cover demonstrates what historian Daryl Maeda has described as the construction of Asian American identity through performing Blackness. IWK adapted the language, style, and political tactics of the Panthers, but this adaptation wasn't merely mimicry. They developed their own approach based on the particular issues that were faced by their own community. The Getting Together newsletters were a source of legal aid and first aid for youth who were vulnerable to police harassment and intercommunity violence. So we can go to the next slide. So IWK wrote a series of what would you do if articles for young Chinese Americans. In one article, what would you do if you were busted? They defined an arrest, outlined the process of being booked at the police station, explained the difference between a felony, misdemeanor, and violation, advised against answering questions from the police, and informed readers about their right to a lawyer. Other articles in their What Would You Do If series outlined first aid procedures in response to blade wounds, bullet wounds, burns, and broken bones. They offered first aid supplies for readers at their organization's free health clinic and suggested carrying these supplies to be prepared to administer aid at any time. They described a recent incident of a man who was stabbed and bled to death in Chinatown, writing, "The police just watched and the ambulance never came." So in the face of state violence and neglect, the organization encouraged community members to provide life-saving care for each other. The provision of first aid was an adaptation of the Panther survival programs in the most literal sense. Accounts of police harassment and unjust arrests of community members in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles filled the pages of Getting Together. IWK noted how the emphasis on law and order in the Nixon era resulted in an increase of Chinese American youth being funneled from the streets to the courts to the jails. At a moment when Asian Americanness was being defined as non-delinquency, IWK members identified policing and incarceration as issues that young Chinatown residents faced because of their racialization as Asian Americans and not despite it. In a newsletter article on laws affecting Chinatown youth, IWK wrote, "When we get busted, even sometimes just for being young Chinese and maybe just sitting in a car, we wind up in jail, then out on bail, then back in the courtroom again and again until the case is finally over. Brothers who have gone through all this know that the American courts and police do not stand for justice and equality." So IWK brought attention to the plight of Chinese youth who are vulnerable to policing and incarceration due to their race, class, and language ability, and the organization also highlighted the impact of the carceral state on Chinatown youth and saw Asian Americans in common struggle alongside other communities of color. The policing of Chinatown youth only heightened under a new police captain in 1974, Edward McCabe of Chinatown's 5th Precinct. McCabe implemented a Get Tough policy to crack down on gangs and gambling in 1974. That December, police shot and killed a 31-year-old man, Su Yi Wu, and injured another, James Liang, in the Jade Chalet restaurant in Chinatown. Plainclothes officers from the 5th Precinct, Joseph Heinemann and Louis Coupeau, entered the restaurant to follow 8 youth who they alleged were gang members. An attorney for 4 of the youth who were arrested and charged with assault stated that they were simply eating in the restaurant when the officers began to harass them. The officers claimed they were almost assaulted and that the youth surrounded Coupeau. Heinemann fired 2 shots in the restaurant, striking bystanders Wu and Liang. In March 1975, a grand jury refused to indict the officer who killed Wu, despite protests by community members to the police, mayor's office, and Manhattan district attorney. The assault charges against the youth were eventually dropped. So this is a familiar story to those of us in 2022, the killing of an unarmed man, the lack of indictment of the officer responsible, the community protests, and this police killing and the grand jury hearing of the responsible officer occurred just before thousands of Chinatown residents took to the streets in response to the beating of Peter Yu. By 1975, organizations like IWK had been raising the issue of police harassment of Chinatown youth for years. And when police officers dragged Peter Yu into the 5th Precinct and beat him following a traffic dispute on April 26, 1975, they did so in full view of a community that had come to see them as an oppressive force in the neighborhood. So 2 demonstrations ensued after the beating of Peter Yu, and we can go to the next slide. The first on May 12, 1975, was organized by the recently established organization Asian Americans for Equal Employment. AAPI was founded a year prior to the protests in 1974 in a campaign against the exclusion of Asian American workers from the construction of the Confucius Plaza building in Chinatown. A crowd of about 3,000 protesters, in a crowd of about 3,000 protesters, young members of AAPI marched alongside older Chinatown community members to City Hall. The organization presented 9 demands to the mayor's office that ranged from a specific focus on the Peter Yu case to broader issues that affected communities of color. So in addition to demanding the dismissal of the charges against Yu, the suspension of the involved officers, and compensation for damages, they also called for broader changes, including an end to police brutality, an end to discrimination in employment, education, health, housing, and social services. And their demands reflected a vision for systemic change that went beyond resolving one individual case of police brutality and to address these multiple forms of oppression against the multiracial poor and working class in the city. So AAPI's demonstration lasted over 11 hours until a representative from the mayor's office invited 6 leaders of the rally to present their grievances to City Hall. There was little movement on AAPI's demands after the rally, and Chinatown community members were further angered after the police captain, McCabe, dismissed the protest and characterized it as a response to the police crackdown on gambling dens. So community members planned a second protest as tension simmered over the lack of response from City Hall and McCabe's association of Chinese Americans with gambling. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association had withdrawn support from the first demonstration that was organized by AAPI, but they were forced to take action after the success of the first protest organized by younger members of the community and urged its constituent business and family associations to shut down shops in Chinatown on May 19, 1975. The demonstration drew out between 10 and 20,000 community members representing a broad swath of Chinatown residents across age, gender, political affiliation, and occupation. After the 2 marches, protesters sought action on their most immediate demands concerning the Yu case. A grand jury dismissed the charges against Yu. Captain McCabe was transferred to a different precinct in response to community pressure. And this was an unprecedented move in the police department at the time. 2 officers who were involved in the beating were indicted for misdemeanor assault and official misconduct. They were both eventually acquitted. And while the Yu case itself reached a resolution, the underlying issues that had drawn thousands of Chinatown residents to the streets had not. Still, AAPI continued their organizing against police violence. They participated in a multiracial coalition, the New York Coalition Against Repression, and supported a demonstration in Harlem to protest the killing of African-American Otto Lee on July 25th, 1975. In light of a case of police brutality in another community, AAPI reflected on the lessons from the Peter Yu protests. So while Captain McCabe was transferred to a different precinct as a concession to the community, the broader demands of the mobilization weren't met. So the organization asserted that employing Black and Puerto Rican police officers would not be an adequate response to the protesters' demands in the Otto Lee case. AAPI wrote, "When we protest and demand the pie, they give us bits and crumbs and tell us we should be happy to get any at all. But the pie, social services, quality education, decent housing, equal job opportunities belongs to us." As the city plunged into a fiscal crisis in 1975 that would lead to cuts to these very services, AAPI reasserted their commitment to a vision of safety beyond policing. And in the aftermath of these protests, they argued that piecemeal reforms were not enough. Rather, the struggle against police violence would require a fundamental restructuring of the city, its values, and its priorities. So in conclusion, the protests following the beating of Peter Yu are too often discussed as spontaneous mass mobilizations. In fact, they occurred on the heels of years of heightened police violence. Asian American movement organizations raised consciousness of the issue, forced the neighborhood's power structure to respond, and demanded solutions that addressed the root causes of violence. The mobilizations in New York's Chinatown were not an isolated example of the Asian American movement confronting the carceral state in the 1960s and 70s. In San Francisco, the Red Guard Party emerged from a group of Chinese American youth who were politicized and angered after being subject to constant police raids. In Los Angeles, the Yellow Brotherhood was founded by Japanese American ex-convicts who wanted to address concerns about teenagers in their communities dying of drug overdoses. So what would it mean to center an understanding of the carceral state in the study of the Asian American movement, the moment when the idea of Asian America was born?
Thank you all so much for this really incredible presentation and really inspiring as well. So we don't have that much time, but I do want to open it up because I know that many of you might have some questions. So we want to just open up to the audience for any questions you might have to the speakers about their work.
Hi, thank you so much for your conversation. I have more of perhaps more of an outreach or a pragmatic outreach question than an academic question. You know, I'm also an advocate for restorative justice and non-carceral solutions. However, there does seem to be a lot of acrimony among Asian Americans between those who do believe in abolitionists, who support abolitionists, and those who are against bail reform believe there should be more police presence. What is the kind of language what kind of language do you use to reach out to those, especially, and I've heard this in our report, like the people who are being most affected are the ones the immigrants, right, the elders, and they're the ones who want more policing, and so it's insulting that you say, okay, defund the police, So I'm just wondering, like, what has been an effective way of talking to them? And I think that's also, if we're talking about solidarity, that seems really tricky and difficult. And I haven't really been able to find the right answers for that. So I was curious about sort of your practice or what kind of language, because you could say that in, at least in academia, we believe in solidarity and restorative justice, but what about when you're actually organizing and talking to people in the community who are scared?
I'm sure others would like to add. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's extremely complex, right? In the work that I've done and organizations I've spoken to, a couple of things come up when you're talking to community members who've directly been affected by some form of violence. So we hear, for example, from gender-based domestic violence organizations who are very clear that they're going to present options to domestic violence survivors, right? Instead of telling them necessarily what to do. Or, for example, I just want to set up, the types, it's a range of, I think, survivors who say these things. I remember very vividly after the massacre at the Oakwood Gurdwara in Wisconsin, where, Harpreet Singh Saini testified before Congress, and he said, I don't want my mother to be just a statistic. I want her death to have mattered in some way. I want policy change, right? And perhaps that is seeking recognition from the state, but in people's minds and experiences, like Harpreet, who lost his mother, that was a very valid demand that he had. So how do we respond to that if we center those needs and we also want to move towards restorative justice practices? I think it's an iterative and evolving process. some of the practices I've seen are one, that we don't diminish or dismiss those needs when people say that. I think that's something that I hear over and over again. It's not the time to say, no, that's not the right way to do it. Why don't you try it this way? So I think really sitting with people who have faced that trauma and understanding where their demands are coming from and not dismissing them. I think sometimes a lot of survivors do feel like that their needs are being dismissed. So that's an important conversation. A second is to, where I said earlier, to have this diverse ecosystem of organizations where if you're not able to respond and assist someone because you don't want them to necessarily go through the carceral state or go to report their hate crime, to actually have other organizations that might be able to assist them as well. Because there are many groups, right? Who will take the complaint, who will move someone through the process of reporting the complaint to police, etc. A third is the deep political education, which is going to take some time in order for folks to know that there are approaches that could be alternative approaches to take. But that from what we've been seeing is something that takes years to actually sit and build with people to understand the impact, as others have traced, of how the carceral state has affected our communities and to identify alternative solutions. So those are just some of the approaches. I don't think that there's, if there were like one or two ways to do it, I think it would have been done. I think that a lot of groups and advocates are sitting with this tension of wanting to center the needs, wanting to pay attention, wanting to do deep listening, and to help, and also identify, some other alternative approaches that folks might be wanting to take. And in this, over the last couple of years, we have seen that, and even before. I remember in the post 9/11 era where there were, for example, something that happened to a mosque, right? Where, like a firebombing at a mosque, where the mosque leader said, instead of that person going through the system, we would prefer to have them come and learn about Islam and be in the community space, right? Or even in the last couple of years, we've seen people say, no, we don't want the state to press charges because we understand that what drove X person to do this is part and parcel of like the root causes of violence. But I think it takes time to get there. So I think that is why the internal community building, the political education, I wish that there were more investments in that, because I really think that's what it's going to take for this to shift over time.
Just to add to that, it's such a complex question. On one of the slides I showed with the statistics that showed that Asian American youth majorities of Asian American youth support the defunding of police. Actually, when you ask them about abolition, that number increases, right? So there's even a lot of tension when it comes
The number goes up or down?
down. Right? They're for defunding the police and they're for redistributing resources, but they're not for abolition on the survey. And so there is a disconnect there that I think requires a lot of unpacking and a lot of local education. So not all Asian American youth, right, support abolition on paper. And why is that? And so I think there is this piece of local education that's still necessary. And sometimes in my work, I actually find that Asian American elders are more inclined to believe in abolitionist ethos and politics. So I work with Asian American tenants, so part of the Chinatown Tenants Union. And one way to connect abolition to sort of the experiences of tenants that are often experiencing evictions, going to housing court, and all of that kind of punitive sort of logic stuff like housing from their landlords. When we show that a lot of the landlords are using the same technologies, like facial recognition, right, the buzzers that the police are using to incarcerate Black and brown folks in the city, I think that's where they start making the connections with sort of these larger carceral systems and their own personal experiences of going to homes that doesn't even do the same thing anymore, right? Knowing that their landlord are surveilling every single move that they make. So it's just
see there's another hand, so I'll make this really quick. Ellen, your history really amazed me, the history of the JACL and the stirrings of affirmative action in the protests by the JACL and trying to create a coalition with African American issues around anti-lynching laws and so forth. This is a history I did not know. So I really thank you for bringing that to our attention. But I want to come back to something that May said in her conversation with Kathy, that, you know, people are always saying, well, why should we talk about Chinese gold miners? What has that history to do with what we're, you know, today, and, you know, this misuse of the word presentism. And so I want to now bring that into this conversation. What has that history, I mean, I see the relationship of that history, but now that, you know, we're talking, you know, we're making all these, you know, these alliances of, you know, Asian Americans are not for affirmative action, and we see that the history of affirmative action is deeply imbricated with the Asian American experience. How can we bring that history into the present day conversation? Is it enough to say, you know, well, this is the history, and some people might say, well, so what? I'm just wondering how you see the use of the history that you are doing for today.
Thanks, Belinda. Yeah, I have been thinking a lot about like that so what. And sometimes I do wonder, like, this is just like a nice to know thing, but it doesn't really matter. You know, I honestly think, because I spent all this time research, but well, I do think a lot about consequences and unintended consequences. For me, that really helps. Like, you know, people have, and then so I don't know if I have a really tight answer for you, I guess, but this history, I've been thinking a lot about how in the middle of the 20th century was an opportunity to build new tools for racial justice or anti-racism, and it was this interesting moment to me because they were really about thinking about the history of Black Americans and sort of what they needed, but the reality was that the United States had a range of people that were not just white and Black, right? And so those tools kind of expand in a way, and so in a way they're like these kind of one-size-fits-all tools that aren't adequate for the diversity of experiences and sort of where people, you know, the kind of what different communities need. And I think we're still living with that kind of imperfect toolkit. And I think that it's just learning the backstory, the history has been helping me try to figure out how to sort of the history part and then sort of in our present day living, how do we navigate that when we do have this set of imperfect tools, and how do we try to, you know, perfect those tools, but understanding and that whole problem of like advocating for our communities and yet sort of understanding they're not disconnected from all this other stuff. So this is not a good answer for you all, Belinda. But I did think there was something really striking to me that, you know, we go back and we can see that Asian Americans, even before, I think there's a misconception that it was only in 1968 when the Asian American movement rose that all of a sudden people had this Asian American identity, or that they worked on issues that were thought of as Black issues. So I'd like to think there's something useful in understanding that, you know, it actually goes back much further. In fact, like Philip Randolph was organizing with Filipino workers in like the 20s and 30s. They were part of the Brotherhood of Steel. So, you know, I mean, I don't know. That's all I can say for now, and I'm still thinking of this question. Thank you.
If I can jump in here too. Okay. I think as a historian, I also kind of think about this question all the time, like what the uses of the past are, and I think particularly for Asian Americans, it's for me about thinking about what stories actually define our communities, because, you know, the conversations from this morning and, you know, just now, you make me think about, for the conversation on affirmative action, it's the kind of Harvard plaintiffs that are defining the stories of Asian Americans right now, and not the 70% of the folks who actually support affirmative action in our communities. And it's the, supporters of kind of carceral solutions to hate crimes that are defining Asian American communities, and not the 75% of the kind of respondents that are supporting defunding the police. So I think part of the work that I think historians are able to do is kind of create that multiplicity of stories that is actually able to define who we are, right? And yeah, I think there is like this emphasis on what stories kind of fit these existing frameworks or these existing ideas that we have about Asian Americans, and they get kind of repeated over and over and over again. Whereas the kind of stories that we're telling, I think, are these counter stories are like kind of run against these kind of established ideas of how the work is hard.
Last question. May.
I just want to say that I was like really amazed by all your talks, and I was actually I was very inspired and educated by every single one of them. I was just very curious about like on the stance of affirmative action. I wasn't exactly sure like where you guys stood on that, because I do know about a lot of the arguments and talks about against affirmative action, and I know a lot of them are Asian led as well. And I remember growing up too, that of course, like I don't actually believe this narrative, but growing up I was told that I might not even get into like a really good school like growing up because of like my race being Asian, because of affirmative action. I was told that commonly, that they would always give it to a Latino or a Black person just because for the sake of diversity. Of course, I didn't actually believe that narrative, but I was frequently told that growing up, that like my race would automatically make me not set for a good school. And it's interesting to know that it was actually affirmative action and that brought a lot of like interracial collaboration, and I was very like inspired about that. But I just wanted to let you know like how you stood on affirmative action, if it's something that should actually be taken down, or if it's like the system itself of admitting students based on race should be evaluated as a whole. So yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I can just respond really quickly. I guess like for me, right, teaching at already a minority therapy institution sort of speaks to my ethos of affirmative action. Absolutely in support of more experiences in diversity, equity in higher education across the board. And I think affirmative action is complicated because when we look at the news, it's often, we see Asian American, a lot of, folks in my parents' age who are out there mobilizing against affirmative action, right? But on the other hand, there are a lot of sort of, again, counter stories, those younger Asian Americans who are testifying, right, in support of affirmative action. And so in thinking about, I think one of like in popular culture, when we think of affirmative action, for some reason, I think of Vivian telling her brother, right, or lied on the application about not being Asian, and that became a whole thing. But I think so often that kind of narrative overshadows these counter narratives of students, right, like you, who are grappling with these questions and want to see more diversity and more representation across the board in their classrooms. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think another way that I would like answer this question too is just why are we fighting for scraps? And so in terms of my personal background, I grew up in New York City, and I went to one of the specialized high schools, right, that is, at the center of all of these debates about the overrepresentation of Asian Americans and about whether affirmative action policy should be implemented there. And I went to that school, which was an hour away on the subway, rather than going to my neighborhood school, which was disinvested in to the point where under Bush's No Child Left Behind, it was closed down and split up into these smaller schools, right? So So the question shouldn't be, whether we should like have a couple hundred kind of low-income Asian American students or other folks of students of color go to this elite school, but why is this school that was down the block from me, in the state that it was in, right? So why are we fighting for scraps? I think is like the kind of question that I feel most invested in.
Thank you, all of you. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from your talks. I have a question about, so a lot of the discussion about solidarity has been with Asian American and non-Asian groups, and I really appreciate the imaginative way you're thinking about how to promote that. So thank you. My question has to do with how do we promote solidarity within our communities? Going off of Kathy's question and this question about, differences in our communities over policing. And I really appreciate your answer that you have to respect people, care for people, and also educate people. It's not a linear path, right? So another question of solidarity. The Diane's talk about radical politics really interested me because I think right now there are fissures within the community between more left-leaning or radical activists and more liberal or centrist types. And so, for example, the opposition to the jail, all those people are not marching for prison abolition. A lot of them are marching because they don't want criminals in the community, right? Even if they're in a jail. So it's very complicated. Like there's 20,000 people demonstrating against the jail. Believe me, we know they're not all abolitionists. So there is a very, and that conversation is difficult, it's fraught, right? It's a kind of correlation of this policing now, right? Because there's an association of crime with Blacks and Latinos. And so I think that's a challenge for activists and organizers. And there's also, I think, I'm really glad you pointed out Red Canary. And I actually had set up this whole project with my students to work with them to help them do research a couple years ago, and then there was a pandemic, so we didn't get to do it. So I'm familiar with them, and I think what they're doing is really interesting because they're talking about not just organizing sex workers and massage parlors, but also like street vendors, people who are kind of very precarious kinds of labor, right? And also suffer a lot of harassment because of the regulations, city regulations. But you also had a photograph of the people demonstrating in front of MoCA. And I think that's an example of groups fighting within the community that is, I feel, really unproductive. And that's been a dividing, it's been very controversial in Chinatown. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how we can promote a progressive left and radical politics, but how we can also build coalitions and not demand that everybody agree on everything. That's always been, I think, a problem in social movements. It's not new. Today, it just seems to me to be more extreme because I think we live in a time of extremes. And I don't know if that's I don't know if that's a sufficient answer. But I think this is one of the challenges we have in terms of solidarity building, both with non-Asian groups, but also within our communities. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Thanks so much for that question. It's a really, really important one and one I've been thinking a lot about. And so, I think at the end of the day, right, despite the fissures, what folks really want is to feel safe, to feel whole, to feel well in their community. And how to get there, I think, is the question. And I do feel as though in this particular, Chinatown politics has always been fraught, but I think in particular now, right, especially with questions around criminalization, the jail, and MoCA, it's especially sort of broad, and I do feel as though there aren't enough spaces where folks can have deep conversation and listening. I think especially as a, as like a social scientist, as an actor, we don't do enough listening already, but I think especially so when it comes to organizing and this kind of work in which we have to be responsible to the base or to other artists, right? I think there is there's a narrowness in that we're not necessarily speaking out and creating new spaces for having conversation. And I think one of the spaces in which this actually is happening in Chinatown is probably with the Wow Project, right? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the space, right? They're one of the few spaces that do actually encourage kind of intergenerational building where there are no assumptions, but you can really enter the space and discuss things like this from a historical, but also thinking towards the future. And I want to see more spaces like that, right? Unfortunately, I think in many ways the community is still patriarchal in nature, and that clouds a lot of what happens. But I'm hopeful, right, to see that there could be more deep conversations, and I want to talk to you more about this afterwards.
Can I just add something? Sure. Yeah, and then I think we're gonna have.
I really appreciate your question. Thank you. I had two responses or reflections to that. So we think about this a lot. We do our work on solidarity with workshops and facilitation. And the thing that we often see is, as you said, like the leftist and centrist folks, right, often get tied up around this sense of purity, like ideological and political purity. And it often makes people really afraid of saying anything at all because they don't want to be canceled or called out. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that folks are on a trajectory of evolving. Like I have changed so much from where I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago in terms of my understanding and analysis. So I think we have to be careful about not setting these bright lines that will just end up alienating the people who are hoping to organize and bring in. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I sometimes worry that the purity that we demand from community members and even ourselves is going to actually make us just fight ourselves instead of white supremacy and the systems out there. So that's something I think to be cognizant about. I think the other piece is just that we also have to be thinking about, as you say, the internal solidarity building, right? There's so many issues within our communities, but the ones that I'm even more concerned about is around, conservative folks within our communities that we need to kind of not just dispense up and say go away, but also figure out how to have conversations with. I think about that within, for example, the Indian community or the Hindu community, where there is this, growth of fundamental Hindutva and ideology, and how are we able to talk to people without, completely dismissing them about that, right? So, or affirmative action or any of these issues. So I think more work to do that internal solidarity building within our house is just as critical as we're doing the external solidarity building with other communities. I think we have to figure out a way to do both.
And I think that's a perfect way to end this panel. Can we just give another round of applause? We'll be here to probably speak to you and answer any other questions. So thank you again.
Sure.
Okay, are they here? Yes, they are.
Three, two, one, cheese. Does one close up? 3, 2, 1, cheese.
I'm not so close, but thank you so much. That was sweet. You know what?
Well, you know how you have your good researcher, you know how to cook it.
Well, actually, there were so in Cisco, they're organized.
Because they were, yeah, I was like, oh my God, this is really good. I was like, I don't really, I remember because like you have style and I can do it. Yeah, like you're
Yeah, I'll definitely watch.
Thinking about that.
It's just that, you know, like, especially with Chang, they just notice that, like, yeah, you know, they will want that, even when it's their history, you know, and I think it's
Yeah, maybe now I have to accept that.
but no, I'm mostly. So I
And it's not most people. A lot of people are thank you. I learned so much from. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. But they don't want to talk. See, because they're talking about people applied to.
I want to be a citizen.
It's a lifetime. There was like anti-jail people, other people writing these books. I just
Like it's kind of like honestly the reality.
Karen doesn't have a conversation. So, yeah, she doesn't have a conversation. This is kind of my ears because his book is contract. No, it's not Andrew. Wait, I'm ready to ride or I went down. Oh, I'm wrong, she's doing it. Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah. I know. The Brooklyn exhibit is only has a handful of participants. It's mostly about Asian American photographers. It's like 30 photographers. Some of whom were kind of OG colleagues. They're also like Tamia. She has photographs in there. Sydney's in it. People who kind of go way back in the basement days, and then it's like on roll. Mentored directly by. So sometimes it's finished to it's up in November, so go before the end of the West District.
So Vivian, thanks for your talk.
I was very serious at first, but
Yeah, I was an IWK. So I was just telling Diane, I'm working on this. Co-editing a book for these. So we did a lot of research. So the ones with those guys linking arms, they were students at Bloomington. School, a whole bunch of them cut school to go to this thing. And one of them is actually a friend of mine. The guy from far left is now a cardiologist in China. And actually we have a picture of him and Dr. Tchen and Courtney in front of that photo. When it was up at
I haven't
last.
I'm also drawn to.
So I'm adding all the text.
I know.
Photography is edited by Wong, who's a colleague. So,
But yeah, they're all.
She knew about Corky and Dr. Chang, posing on this. So he knew about the doctor. And then when I started working in the book, well, I know how to talk to him. He's a friend of my family. And so I talked to him and I said, Dr. Chen, who are the other people? So he knew that. He told me. He said, oh yeah, we all cut school from Bloomington. I don't think so. The short guy, I think he's passed away. I wrote down the name somewhere. And then the two tall guys were brothers. They weren't twins, but they were brothers.
It could be Antarctica. It could be Antarctica.
One of them runs a little business. So Dr. Tchen has that picture in his office.
Plus side, you should know this. Which was great growing up, but there's some advantage to it.
He's very active. He's actually really active in China. He's the Chinese American medical society.
Actually, sort of end up with that.
I was talking before about the student who's doing certification. Yeah, everybody thinks Hong Dang. You know Hong Dang?
She introduced me to her. But I also know her.
Yeah.
And then so the thing about so the interviews that I did, I'm curious what is reality? I think what I understood from people is that the gangs were really out of control, and they originally were kind of formed as enforcers of the extortion and the associations who go into businesses, protection. And they became so aggressive and fighting with each other that the Tongs could not even control them. So, again, the police protection was like indiscriminate. Any young person was subject to so I think that one of the things that I thought a lot about looking at voting is the amazing intergenerational workers, elders, middle-aged workers, and young people in all those institutions. And what I figured out is I think it's because starting in the 60s, but really in the 70s, you have this proliferation of social service agencies funded with government money. CPC is one of the first, but then you also have Project Reach, Two Bridges, Hamilton Madison have been around for a long time, but they got money to do housing organizing all these things. And so you have all these young people who are not all necessarily radicals, but they're young, they're left-wing, they're anti-Buddhist, they're more, they're
OG, right? The
equality
original,
and
right?
civil rights. And they are the social workers and the organizers who run these agencies. And so their work, a lot of it, so their work is not only like providing services, but also educating constituents. When they say, oh, there's this horrible thing that happened, so all the seniors would go to the demonstration. So I think there's this new infrastructure in Chinatown that starts to move the CCBA or to the sidelines because they can't take care of, they don't take care of it. They're just kind of wielding kind of Cold War power.
I just showed clips.
So I think it's this, I really thought it was this issue. And all those photos about whether it's AAPI or whatever or whatever, you see this amazing array of kids, they just turn it all out. And so I think that we're doing this thing, we're doing this program at Columbia on 19th. I work with labor arts, which did this liberation of the workers' strike in 1982. So we did we just opened a photo exhibit, which is Porky's photos, but others as well. It's on campus. And then we're doing a program on October with two Asian American professors and a teacher who grew up in homes in Chinatown where their mothers and grandmothers were farming workers. And so one of them is Vivian at Hunter and Amy Tchen, who teaches at Vassar.
Added it later, very few people enrolled because they didn't know what
He was a kid at Barton daycare center, and now he's a teacher in the daycare center. So I think it's really, so there's, I think the intergenerational connection is really important. That generation, they really have to experience and somehow it's difficult
So,
there is a management. I can't usually teach them.
Yeah, well, you have,
I have 40, and there are a lot of,
not just protests, but the really big ones. So CPC gets on the senior center, daycare center.
Okay, we're gonna start our okay, we're gonna start our second session. So if you just grab your coffee and some sweets to keep your energy going, we'll get started in just a second. And it'd be great if any of you are kind of feeling in the back and come up a little bit, that'd be great. But see, yeah, come on up here, that'd be fantastic. Okay, hello everybody. It's great to have so many of you stay longer, and in many ways, for me, this is the kind of session where we begin to actually talk about on-the-ground practices. So I'm really delighted to be chairing this session. And it's so fantastic to be here in person. Just those of us who are from our campus, it's so great to be seeing each other. Some people I've only been doing work with online, and it's just such a revelation to actually see the actual person and to be able to kind of interact and welcome everybody who's not from our campus. We're really delighted that you could be here. My name is Chen. I'm a historian, curator, organizer, And I'd love to jump into some of the discussions that got started earlier in the day, so I'm not sure we're going to get to do that. But what I'd like to just say about myself also is that since shifting, some of you may know me from NYU, but since shifting here to Rutgers-Newark, this is the beginning of my 5th year, which I can't believe. But I've been doing a lot of work with Monsieur Lenape folks that I began to work with at NYU. And it's really enabled me to kind of dig deeper into the colonial history and relations of this region. And that's something that I'm hoping we can also be framing, and something I think we certainly talked a little bit about that, but it also frames really what does it mean to be Black, what does it mean to be Asian in that kind of deeper colonial context, what does it mean to be Latinx, Hispanic, whatever formation, what does it mean to be part of the Atlantic world? So I'm hoping we can kind of touch on some of those questions because they are both deep issues of history and historical interpretation, but also practice as we begin to kind of play these questions out in a curricular way. Let me just kind of give a brief introduction to our panel, and then they're going to each talk about the 2 sets of projects that they've been involved in, and we're going to mainly then be engaged in discussion about the comparisons, the differences, strategies, and really, I think, touching on a number of the questions that have been coming up, but really in terms of actual on-the-ground work with families, communities, parents, and the students themselves. Okay, so Jason Oliver Chang is an associate professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut, where he also serves as director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. As a public servant, he sits on the Board of Education for West Hartford Public Schools, the Governor's Hate Crimes Advisory Council, and the State's Historical Records and Archives Board. He is co-founder of Make Us Visible, a grassroots organization advocating for Asian American and Pacific Islander studies. We've not been talking about Pacific Islanders, so I'm glad you'll be perhaps mentioning that. Educational reform in K-12 public schools, and is a director of the Connecticut chapter. I also want to commend you to the book, the scholarship that Jason has done, called Chino, and it's really about Chinese in Mexico. And I think that has, of course, the research connections to the on-the-ground practice work we do. It has direct connections. So I'm hoping to have you bring some of those insights that you've done from your research into this context and discussion as well. Kathy Liu is the co-founder of the Immigrant History Initiative, a nonprofit that produces educational resources on immigrant histories and aims to fundamentally change change how we learn, talk, and think about race, immigration, and social justice in America. I mean, that's going to be at the heart. If you look at their website, you'll just see how serious they are about that challenge. She has over 10 years of experience working with AAPI immigrant communities, and at IHA has partnered with PBS to create lesson plans for the series Asian Americans, provided programming for Boston Public Schools and the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, and organized with communities in the Northeast. Ms. Liu grew up in Oregon and holds a Juris Doctor from Yale Law School and a BA in International Relations and Chinese from Pomona College. Julia is co-founder and co-executive director of the IHI. She has also published several articles on immigration and Asian American identity. Since co-founding IHI, she has developed official PBS learning media lessons and also has led training workshops in Asian American history and law, and identity for many institutions, educators, including the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the Smithsonian, and other public and private secondary schools on the East Coast. Julia also obtained her JD from Yale Law School and an MPhil in history from the University of Cambridge and her AB in history from Harvard. part of what I'm really I'm hoping we can do is to also begin to think about the kind of framing of multi-generational work, so that curricular work in some ways is a perfect setting for that. And to also not think about doing curriculum and working with teachers as somehow a trickle-down effect, but in fact, it's in many ways can be seen as a primary site of research and engagement, which really enriches what we can actually benefit from studies. So I think there's a much more dynamic kind of way of understanding the work that's being done that I look forward to hearing about. So we're going to begin. I think we can just all sit down and we'll begin with Jason, and then he'll reflect for a few minutes about his work, and then we'll see. Jason.
Wow, thank you, Jack. This is such an amazing symposium to be a part of. Thank you for to the organizers and everyone involved that made this possible. Yeah, so I think maybe I'll start just by kind of telling a story about the work how I came to this work. I scheduled my sabbatical for spring 2020, and that was during the pandemic. So my intended research project was to go to the Philippines and Hong Kong to do work on maritime histories that predate migration to the United States. And that project kind of doesn't exist anymore. But what I found, instead, for my sabbatical, I tried to pass legislation. And I was frustrated by the kinds of media attention we were getting. I was only asking really one question of Asian American scholars at the time, which was, why is anti-Asian racism on the rise? And there was just no historical experience to draw connections to this lived reality. And so I knew that, well, I'm also drawing from experiences of teaching for 10 years in a public university, where students are asking me, why do I have to wait so long to learn about my history? And really, college is too late, right? And we've known this for a long time. And that motivated me to get more involved in schools. So I ran for school board. I was appointed for a vacant seat, and then ran and was reelected for the school board position. And that allowed me to see kind of how our public school system can be shifted and moved. And so we, with a ragtag group of other folks in Connecticut, we formed Make Us Visible. We won legislation in 2021 that made a new mandate to create a model curriculum. That doesn't mean it has to be implemented, but a model curriculum for K-8 social studies. And this came with the addition of Native studies, LGBTQIA studies, and climate change, and a number of other issues that was meant to transform social studies in the K-8 space. The following year, we pushed for new legislation. Again, last legislative session, we won a K-12 AAPI education mandate. And that gives the anchor for that model curriculum, and it creates the expectation that these courses and material will be taught in every school in Connecticut. That's a big job. And one that the State Department of Education and the State Education Resource Center is unprepared to deliver on. They would say themselves they don't have the resources or expertise to implement this. So, what we, as the director of the Asian American Studies Institute, see this as a really critical opportunity to shift the mission and purpose of our role in the public university, not just to facilitate research and deliver a curriculum, but to really serve the public in new ways. And in seeing this work unfold at the legislative level and with communities, we realized that the work cannot happen just in the university. that we have to do so many other things outside of the university. That the university is kind of a limited space in which it's a special space that is important, but other work has to be done to make critical connections to other agencies, and open up the university to the public. So one of the ways that I've done that is to create an activist in residence program at UConn, where people who are doing work in the communities can have access to university resources and then amplify their impact with teachers, with communities. And so these are some of the mechanisms that we've decided to kind of build the capacity in order to meet this need. Now, Make Us Visible is a group that formed basically out of students and parents, teachers, other educators. And this was, what I have to say is young Asian American women were an incredible force in Connecticut, talking about their experiences in public schools and wanting to have their communities represented in the curriculum was an incredible, compelling force in the legislature that really transformed how this law got passed in Connecticut. So, it's created a lot of new issues related to how, okay, so if we have a new mandate in Asian American Studies, what is that? What is that curriculum? We know that in some ways, as we've been discussing all morning, Asian Americans don't see eye to eye on a lot of issues. Rather than come out the gate and say, this is what Asian American Studies is, our plan is to go out to communities and say, you tell me what your Asian American history is. And also, I think the approach or the dialogue that we had in the first panel about presentism was really apt because in some ways the Asian America that is presented in our scholarship sometimes is irrecognizable by community members, and that there has to be some translation work and building dialogue around what that means. So it's really challenged us to think, as Jack, as you indicated, that the kind of methodological shift, right, that includes the participation of families, teachers, schools as active, participants in both becoming Asian Americanists for their own communities, but then also developing, and enriching their own pedagogies, right, that are appropriate for their school. So in driving a kind of what I've been terming a kind of homegrown Asian American studies in Connecticut is about paying attention to the composition of our communities. And Connecticut happens to be majority, if we break down country of origin, majority South Asian. And is also a post-65 state in which the majority of Asian Americans came to the state after 1965. Right, so more than doubled in the last 2 decades. Right, so so this is, these are communities that have not been visible in Connecticut politics, cultural imagination, and that we have a lot of work to do. But we want to do that work with with the communities that we're working with as partners in its creation, right? And there's a purpose for that, right? So say that we had a stock curriculum that we could share out with schools. Communities might not support that. They might not see themselves in that, right? The important thing is for when it comes to schools that there are families and organizations and students who are saying, I helped make that. That's accurate. That's about my community. Right? And so there's a way that in this process, it's made me think about the differences between sort of like content construction in curriculum, right? But then also political strategy and campaign strategy. How do we scale up from serving several hundred students every couple of years at university in our Asian American Studies curriculum to serving 172 school districts in the state. According to the law that we got passed, we have till 2025 to meet that. So we were able to buy votes in the legislature by pushing our timeline out. And so that allowed us now to work with the State Department of Ed as a partner and other school groups like the Connecticut Council for Social Studies to really begin to transform not just the curriculum, but the standards that drive curricular engagement in all schools. So we really see our larger aim as building long-term political power for Asian Americans in the state to have them involved in racial justice. And in order to do that, they need to know about themselves, they need to practice using their voice, and they need to have a stake in what public education looks like. So maybe I'll stop there and to my amazing colleagues.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Everyone, are you working? Okay, great. Yeah, I just want to say for giving a brief introduction to our organization and what we do, that it's really a great honor to be in this room. So you can probably tell from the bios in our work, we are lawyers who are big fans of history and historians, so it feels like a real coup to be here. So I wanted to start with kind of a personal story that links up, I think, to why Kathy and I started this organization, because for us, this work is deeply personal. It responds, I think, in some way selfishly to our own lived experiences and our own childhoods. So I'll kind of start there. So I'm Chinese American. I was born in China and came to this country when I was 9. I lived in a incredibly white suburban town in Illinois. And growing up, I think there were a lot of different things going on, right? Being the child of immigrants, being an immigrant myself, and being an Asian American and a woman, I never really saw any narratives, both in the media or the classrooms, that reflect my lived experiences. And so I became obsessed with history, I think, in some ways, to kind of find the stories that most resonated. But it always had to be sort of, like close enough, right, or good enough, or it resonated in some way, but not quite the way that maybe I wanted. And so I studied history in college. I went to grad school for history, decided that I wasn't sure if I wanted to be an academic, so I went to law school, or Kathy and I met during our first week of law school. And something really interesting happened in law school was that I started to see Asian American names in the textbooks, particularly in constitutional law, immigration law. And for the first time, there were these people who were not just victims, right, passing names in the history, but were, I think, fighting tremendous injustice, right, and kind of challenging laws that I think really kind of shaped every aspect of life for people who look like me, for people who look like my parents. And so that was when I kind of had somewhat of a breakdown, and I started doing a lot of reading. I know maybe nice in the room, I want to give a shout out to her book, Immigrant, which really changed and sort of made a lot of things make sense, I think, for me, even when I was
I didn't write that book.
Sorry, I'm sorry, what?
That's based on.
And they don't go sorry. I am so sorry. How embarrassing. No, it was your book. It was the Impossible Subject. I am so sorry, May. This is deeply embarrassing.
No, it's flattered, but I couldn't let it go.
Thank you. Well, the Least Below is also wonderful. And I do like that book a lot too. But and so, I started to think about what it would have meant to have learned these stories as a child, right, growing up, and whether some of these stories might have changed the way I thought about myself, might have changed the way my parents talked to me, right, about their experiences and my own experiences. And this was happening, in 2016 at a time where, with the election and kind of the resurgence of anti-immigrant xenophobic rhetoric, we also started to see a lot of those narratives really proliferate in the Chinese American community. So I think one of the key reasons we started really, I think, was to kind of bring new narratives, bring narratives that have been sort of told and championed and fought for really, right, in academia and higher education that are not in the communities. And so we actually started out not doing work in K-12 schools, but creating programs for first and second generation communities, mostly Chinese American, to kind of bring this history and also bring a space, right, for folks to learn history that, right, is that they are a part of, right, or that reflects, right, their own lived experiences. And that's actually why we started. And so now, the second kind of inflection point was in 2020, right, with COVID and the rise in anti-Asian violence, and I think the start of some of these conversations, we started to get a lot of requests from parents in school saying, like, this is a crisis point in our school, like, we want to support our parents, we want to support our kids, but we have no idea how. And that was when we started to actually do more work in the K-12 space, actually first working with Asian American families, right, and bring a little bit of that history, but really as a context and understanding why these stereotypes exist, why these perceptions exist, but also provide, I think, a really caring space that's, mental health informed, trauma informed for them to start having these conversations. And so 50% of our work now as an organization is around bringing Asian American history and focused programming to Asian American communities themselves, and kind of using these programs as a way for primarily, I would say, first generation parents and second generation kids, right, to talk about these histories. I think use this a lot of this context, right, to think about what it means to be Asian American, and also what they want to do, right, in the face of injustice, right, in the face of and sort of how to connect that identity, I think, with thinking about how to engage, right, civically, how to engage with their communities, and really the most pressing issues of our day, even beyond immigration or racial justice. So I'll kind of stop there and turn over to Kathy.
Hi folks, can you hear me? Okay, I can hear myself, awesome. Hi, so I'm Kathy. I'm the other co-founder of the Immigrant History Initiative, pronounced she, her, her. Really excited to be in this space with all of you today. So I know Julia gave kind of the origin story of our organization, so I won't go into that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about our K-12 work, because this is also a part of the work that is really close to my heart. I remember, so similar to Julia, I'm also Chinese American, I'm second generation. I was actually born in New York City, but we moved when I was really young to predominantly white town in Oregon. I remember I was taking AP US history in high school, and the textbook, I think it was the American Pageant, it was one of those really big AP US history textbooks, and I can tell you literally where on the page the single paragraph about the Chinese railroad workers was. It was on the right side, it was a single paragraph, it was like the last one in the column on the very edge of the page, because I was fixated by it. And I couldn't even, I remember thinking at the time, like, I wasn't quite sure why it was so interesting to me. It was like literally a single paragraph, very little detail, right? But I remember looking at it and being like strangely excited by it, thinking to myself, like, this is like sparking something, right? Like, I feel like this is a history that I want to learn more of. And then of course I didn't, right? So the rest of the school year we kind of moved on. But a lot of the work that we do in the K-12 space is about trying to create these entry points to bringing in Asian American narratives into public school spaces and public school and independent school spaces. And so we do both curriculum development and also professional development and teacher training, right? So in the curriculum development space, I think, and maybe I think a lot of the folks in this room might already know, there's a lot of actually really great curriculum that's already out there. So the approach that we take is to try to be additive rather than duplicative, and also to create resources that are really easy for educators to use. Educators are like extremely busy, right? They have very little time to be lesson prepping, and even less time to go out and to research histories that they themselves did not learn before. And so we provide these lesson plan resources, we align them to standards as much as possible, but we also provide things like Google Slides, worksheets in the form of Google documents that they can literally just make a copy of and then change however they need to integrate it into their classroom in the shortest amount of time and labor possible. And then I would say the kind of flip side of this equation, right, is the teacher training. And I know Jason has talked a lot about how Make Us Visible has been so instrumental in driving this fight for Asian American Studies mandates, AAPI Studies mandates, really across the country now, starting in Connecticut and like moving outward. And one of those states where that happened is, of course, New Jersey. And so we've been involved very, I would say, intimately in thinking about how to train educators in New Jersey, because that's one really important part of this equation, right? Because once you have the legislative mandate in place, how are you going to enforce it? And how are you going to make sure that the educators are actually teaching these histories in ways that are accurate, that are genuine, and that are I think, in the framework of kind of like building empathy, right? Rather than checking off just something on a list. And so in New Jersey, we have trained now hundreds of educators in different school districts. The first one that we started with was Princeton Public Schools. We've also worked with the New Jersey Teachers Union and JEA. And I think what has been really interesting about working in New Jersey, unlike Connecticut, so I think Jason might have mentioned, right? So they pushed through a second piece of legislation with that deadline in 2025, and this is a funded mandate. So in Connecticut, there is funding to be able to train teachers, to be able to develop curriculum. In New Jersey, what we currently have is an unfunded mandate. So, so yeah, it's an interesting question about implementation. How are we actually going to put this into practice? And as a 501c3 nonprofit, I think IHI, obviously, we're not looking to earn money, but we are looking to keep the lights on. And so it's been an interesting negotiating process with school districts across the state in terms of the money that they're willing to allocate from their budgets. And I think this is an ongoing conversation and potentially something that there will still need to be policy advocacy around in the coming months and years. I'll just stop it at there. I know we've been talking for a while, and maybe we can move on to the conversation.
Yeah, there's so much overlap in some ways, and I'd love for us to spend a little bit of time on that. Part of what's fantastic here is in what's conventionally thought of as the New York metropolitan region, that we're talking about Connecticut, we're talking about New Jersey, which usually don't get attention, right? But in fact, that's what's happened, right? There's been so much, not just people starting out in New York City and moving out, but also separate direct settlement in these areas. So a lot of the scholarship that's happened, and a lot of the attention and programming that's happened has been very New York centric or California centric or whatever, right? So I'd love to just hear a little bit about, how as you both have, all three of you have been kind of sharing information, what could be characteristic of that shift that's going on? I'm just kind of curious. And then in some ways you're already intimating that the organizing strategy kind of emerges out of that. So go into that a little bit more, and then we can also get into some other critical questions.
So one of the things that, and I think this is really kind of informed by where Kathy and I grew up, and sort of the type of Asian American community we saw growing up. I think with post 1965 and sort of the 80s, there have been many different waves of Asian American, largely immigrant communities that have kind of risen up, right? And I think what we're seeing now is since 2020, a lot of these communities that are outside of traditional enclave, so to speak, right? Places like New York City or San Francisco, I think are activated in many different ways because of what happened during COVID. And I think a lot of our work, right? We wouldn't, there would be no mandate if it were not for Make Us Visible New Jersey and kind of the really great organizing work they did across the state. And, the majority of folks who are in that group, I think, identify as, sort of children of immigrants or more recently arrived. And I think you're seeing kind of the demographic shifts geographically that kind of reflect, right, the organizing and the kind of new and sort of different movements that are happening, not just across the East Coast, it's actually in many different states across the country. Made us as well because it's a really great organization that's kind of brought them together.
So sorry, Jack, I have to ask a bad student question. I missed exactly the shift that you're talking about. What was the shift?
Well, really the decades by decades demographic shifts towards adjacent adjacent regions, and also direct migration into those regions, such as Connecticut and New Jersey, as opposed to going through, let's say, New York, Flushing, and China. And what change does that bring about? So, and in some ways, the organizing strategy. So I really appreciate how all three of you think as organizers. So how does that impact the organizing strategy as well? And it's already kind of implicit in what you're saying, but we reinforce the surface.
Yeah, actually, this question makes me think a lot about our community programming, as opposed to our specifically K through 12 work. So I think, as Julia mentioned, we're both part of kind of that, quote unquote, maybe new wave, right? Like moving out to areas where we don't have kind of major historic Asian enclaves, and I think both of our experiences are very much informed by that migration shift. And so in terms of, just to take a couple steps back, right? So at IHI, we've started this community leadership program called the Asian American Leadership Program, specifically to bring Asian American history and identity development directly to Asian American families, multiple generations. So the idea is that there's both an adult track and a youth track that is happening at the same time in their own peer groups, and they come together for facilitated intergenerational dialogue. And I think one of the things that I am most hoping to do with this program actually is to bring it to spaces that are outside of major cities, outside of places that have a lot of API basic infrastructure, right? Because I think, say what you like about like New York City or San Francisco or LA or whatever, there's a lot of API organizations out there. If you look at Oregon, if you look at Illinois or North Carolina, there's much, much fewer. And so I think one of the ways that we're hoping to bring it out to these maybe more isolated communities is by going through existing cultural networks. And so we are partnering with the Chinese School Association of the United States, actually, this fall to take advantage of their 500-member network of heritage language schools across the country. So by Chinese schools, I'm talking about those language schools on the weekends that are generally like taught by volunteers, organized by like the Chinese American parents in the community. And so in this way, taking advantage of these existing kind of cultural and heritage networks to be able to meet the community where they're at, meet them in the places where they're already gathering and already coming together to seek to kind of preserve a part of their cultural heritage or a part of their identity, and to be able to inject this kind of history learning, but also identity development, and in some ways kind of political activation as well in these spaces. It's really important to us.
Yeah, those approaches are so important. I think, I'm so inspired by the work, the approach that you've taken to involve them and to keep their needs as central to how you guys move forward. And it's not like that as a platform, but they're integral to how you think about what is developed out of that relationship. That's really special about how you guys do this work. In Connecticut, one of the things I recognized after moving there 10 years ago was the ways that, in terms of the demographic shifts that you're speaking about, Jack, is after 9/11, many Chinese families left the city and went to Connecticut. They moved to the Indian reservations and began working for the casinos. And this is a unique, feature of Connecticut's, coast. And there, I had a student from one of those communities 2 years ago who was connecting with material in my class on Asian American history, discussing the relationship between poverty and a documented migration and with her community in Connecticut near these Indian reservations. And so I think it's in the process of, as you state, meeting communities where they are, allowing them to tell their stories, that we get to the really core questions within Asian American studies. Those are still operative questions about imperialism, about racial formations, triangulation. They're all embedded in their stories, right? If we start there, though, we won't make that connection. Right? We start with where Asian American Studies is as a field, as our opener, as our welcome mat. We're not going to have that same connection with communities. And so I think, to me, that research step is like, I need to know what your story is, right? And that becomes the way that the entry point back into the field, to say, yes, your story is valid and is important and reflects the core questions that we want all students in Connecticut to learn about in all of these other states. So I think that, to me, is like how some of that translation work and the shift of like how the community-oriented kind of scholarship is sort of positioned. Because I think to me, it relates to how I've interpreted the call to include Pacific Islander studies, because there are very few Pacific Islanders in Connecticut, but Connecticut is so deeply entangled with the Pacific in many important ways. The Coast Guard's, major academy is in Connecticut, with major, bureaucratic functions of managing sea forces in the Pacific, and having the first, Jamoran cadets, Coast Guard cadets, living in Connecticut and training there as a part of the U.S. colonial apparatus. Right, so going back from like whaling all the way into the contemporary military-industrial complex, where we have Filipino sailors and submarine workers, and all of these really important connections that are, again, a part of the core questions in Pacific Islander studies. They are relevant to how Connecticut became the state it is today, and also its future. It is a manufacturing site for U.S. naval power. Nuclear submarines are built there and housed there, and this is one place where those realities have, those aspects of the military-industrial complex have a footprint in the state. So telling those stories actually connects people to the material economic conditions of the state. And when we ask questions about, say, state funding for schools, right, it's connected to those kinds of larger economic issues of the state budget. So like in Connecticut, we spend about $56 per student, on average, about $56 per student on STEM, right? We spend 5 cents per student on civics. And that's in Connecticut, right? So, which is sort of known for its education system. So, when we think about this approach to telling stories, to building a public conversation about what Asian American studies looks like in the K-12 environment, we want people's stories to be represented, to broaden that conversation of what is the job of caring for the public good when we consider these stories in this fashion, right? As equal on parity with those that we would think of as typical Connecticut, residents. And so I think that, to me, that's why I say, it's about education, but it's about long-term political engagement to build that, to create pathways for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to contribute to racial justice in the state.
I love this. So really what all three of you are bringing up is really the possibilities of organizing with historical imagination, not so much being historians per se, but also organizing with a framing that history is important, people's experiences are important, working with where they're arriving and where they're starting in terms of how they're encountering the public schools and the colleges. And somehow it sounds like also some of the students from UConn are also then getting back involved. And because it's a state university, in our case, we're very much a commuter campus, so that the students are able to kind of link in many ways back, as opposed to the residential campuses where students may be hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where they are. But there's a way in which they then become links back into communities that they come from and can help with the organizing of our curriculum issues and things like that. So one of the issues that's come up during the day is really the class questions, the complexity of class questions within our communities. Some of us may come from non-Cantonese backgrounds, for example, just to take the Chinese American example, non-Chinatown backgrounds. In some ways, it forces us to deal with a kind of historical reckoning of who do we identify with. But it also creates lots of fractions and divisions in terms of who the parents or the grandparents or the children or the grandchildren identify with, and whether they're willing to give money and support those kinds of efforts or not, right? And therefore, the challenge to kind of Asian American organizing on the ground, I mean, when Deepa is talking about organizing on the ground in communities, I'm not thinking so much about Asian American studies, I'm really thinking about on the ground in communities, how those formations actually happen, how do people identify as well. So I'm just curious what your experiences have been in terms of the complex class tensions that may exist. When we think of Connecticut from the point of view of Chinatown, New York, we think of, oh, it's where the successful, wealthy people go to, right? It's more complex than that, of course. But the same could be said of New Jersey. Oh, it's people who left New York City, left Brooklyn, and they moved into the suburbs, and they now have cars and whatever. So I'd love to hear those complexities that you're grappling with. And does that come into conflict when you're talking about where they're starting with, right? If you're dealing with where they're starting with, then how does that play out in terms of the kind of history they want to hear, or history they want you to do? Maybe anybody, yeah.
Chang, thank you for framing these questions and also in dialogue between these two different spaces. I think it's so refreshing to take a step back out of the Connecticut hit space and to think relationally across these different these communities. So I think one thing that has occurred to me in the course of organizing for legislative reform, but then also having, seeing conversations within schools around the state, is that families and other communities don't really have a language to talk about classism. Or maybe they do, but it's not something that is like a comfortable topic, right? And so, and I mean, the same with racism, and the presence of anti-Black racism in Asian American communities. So I think in some ways, at least, okay, I'll give you an example. So in over the summer, we created a new program in Greenwich with the India Cultural Center there. So partnering with the Institute and the Greenwich Historical Society, we're doing a project where we have South Asian American youth who are going to be interviewing their parents and grandparents to construct a kind of oral history around their identity, and then those will be featured in the Greenwich Historical Society, and maybe combined with photos, and so we've taken that as an opportunity to begin to educate both the students and the parents about sort of the contours of their own story, right? So when we ask them to kind of build like a rough timeline for their family's migration story, it gets them to begin to think about, say, the relationship of when different immigration policies were passed and how that may have shaped their family's choices. And that provides them with the understanding that, oh, these larger conversations have impacted my life. And so it's that kind of, that ability, it's like a muscle to kind of get them to think about the I or the me and the we, the larger we. And it's those shared kind of moments across different timelines or across different stories that begin to create that self-awareness that oh, this is, we were able to move, we were able to migrate after partition in India because of these class qualities to our family, right? And so those are ways that once it becomes, they can recognize that for themselves, I think that then gives us a possibility for developing that kind of conversation between folks, or at least they will recognize that maybe then for another group that they're not as familiar with. So we see it as, so in that form of interaction, it's like laying into that a framework of understanding or giving them certain kinds of containers to fill, right? Like, what was your, the person who immigrated first in your family, what was their first job in the United States? Like, use that story to kind of excavate some meaning around that context. And then that allows us to kind of develop even more questions later on. The one I love the most is what do most people get wrong about you? And that one really opens up a lot because it kind of transcends some of, you don't have to put like model minority out on the table, right? It eventually may work its way back in. When you ask what do people get wrong about you, it allows them to kind of self-assess and draw from their emotional experiences of alienation that really deliver a more authentic kind of connection to these larger issues, these larger mechanisms of oppression and division that I think are at the core of some of those community conversations.
So part of what you're really also talking about as an organizing approach is that affective connection, and kind of connecting with where people are at, how they're thinking of themselves at the moment, given the complexities of their background and what's going on during COVID. That's really. Does this resonate for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to give you a really blunt answer, Jack, right, in terms of these complex class tensions, I think especially when we look at, and feel free to push back, Jason, because I know we're not as directly involved in some of these organizing efforts, but my impression of a lot of these organizing efforts around the AAPI studies mandate is that the folks who are actively involved are pretty overwhelmingly from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, right? So higher socioeconomic classes. And I think there's like a number of different reasons for this, right? First of all, I think like they're the ones who have time, right? They're the ones who have the time and the resources to be worrying about what their kids are learning in school, to be really kind of like fired up and angry that their family stories are not being represented in the curriculum in a way that somebody who is working 80 hours a week simply does not have the time to do. And I think very much this plays out in a lot of in some of, I think, the policy objectives that I've heard like certain communities express, right? So for example, I know in Connecticut at one point there was a contingent that was very interested in marrying the AAPI studies mandate with a provision to forbid data disaggregation for the AAPI community, because the idea is that well, I guess my belief is that the idea might be that this would negatively impact families that are more affluent and more well off. So it is complicated, and to be honest, I think a lot of it is ugly, right? A lot of it is really, really messy because that's like the reality of the situation. The way that these communities have grown up, so many of them have come in very, very divergent ways, in ways that have deeply impacted the ability to accumulate things like generational wealth and resources. And in many ways, I think, Jason, what you said about the fact that many of the people that we work with, like we don't even have, what was the word you used? Like we don't even have kind of like a framework or a language to talk about these class tensions. And I think that's very much the case. And I think just thinking about some of the folks that we work with. So for example, in Connecticut, for a long time, we ran a program at the local Chinese school in New Haven called the Southern Connecticut Chinese School. And I remember what I found somewhat striking about a lot of these students is that I think not only did they not have a language to talk about these class tensions were very much invisible to them, right? I think there was very little thinking around, oh, there's actually like a lot of diversity in terms of income and wealth within the API community. It's simply a conversation that wasn't being had and something that I think many of them were quite blind to. And so I think a lot of what Jason is talking about in terms of trying to excavate these oral histories, bring these conversations up in ways that are deeply relevant to their personal lived experiences, to be able to build that empathy, right? To be able to build that kind of affective connection is extremely important. And I think also very much what we try to do in our community programs as well. It's something that not enough people are talking about. So thank you so much for this question.
I guess I'll just add one thing. One of the ways that we've talked a lot about this, for many years, it was our work was largely Chinese American. I think in many ways, it's still some of our community work is still very much focused on Chinese Americans. And I think what we found is that it is really important to kind of work within sort of different ethnic communities, and even like a Chinese kind of label sort of ties a lot of the kind of regional diversity, language diversity, etc. But I think one of the things that was in this class that Kelly mentioned, this program we did, right, a lot of these kids are the children of Chinese engineers or scientists or I think people who came post 65, right, as part of the tech boom or the medical boom. And I think for a lot of them, they were really, because they grew up in America, right, and they're being told sort of with this dual consciousness that you're both American and you're not because you're Asian. I think a lot of them were craving for more narratives, and in some ways I think it made it easier for us to tell narratives of other groups that are of different socioeconomic classes. But I think that we sort of see it as, right, kind of influential, right, on their lived experiences, as well as I think very much in existence, right, with their lived experiences. And so we bring them to New York City, for example, to go to Boca and kind of look at the history. And I think a lot of the kids certainly are able to think about us through these case studies, right? And I think, I don't know, sort of, if we were to ask them now what they would think, but I think it was for many of them an introduction to, class in a way that they had not sort of envisioned before. And I think we're still working out, right, how to talk through a lot of these things with parent generations. I think a lot of them, right, I think socioeconomic security is so tied to their trauma and to their migration stories and kind of the trajectory, right, of how a lot of these immigrants kind of reach a certain level of economic status. And I think we're still trying to figure out how to do that. But one way we've seen we've been able to kind of have the language around this is exactly doing what Jason and people in Connecticut are doing, which is kind of having intergenerational conversations, right, about their parents' experiences and sort of the hardships and kind of thinking about both the privileges and kind of right, the hardships that they've gone through. But it is a really hard question. I don't think we have a good answer or a solid answer.
So then I'm going to raise a harder question. Because I've been grappling with this myself, which is, it just so happened I kind of got more and more involved in this issues of eugenics and contemporary legacies of eugenics. And once you deal with eugenics and its contemporary resonances, then of course you kind of fall right into profound questions of how abilities and ableism has been formed in American society and how groups of people are sorted as well. So in some ways there's a larger language of sorting and ableism that Asian American Pacific Islander studies also becomes a part of, so that when we're talking about solidarity coalitions, I'm just wondering what are those, people were talking about toolkits earlier, what are some of those analytical, historical, affective tools that are actually useful what hasn't worked. And so I'm just curious if the language of ableism has any valence at this point. Not. You know, what generations are responsive to that or not. There's so much of an effort to blend in and fit in and to do well. And the pressure to test well and to get into Harvard and feeling that you're being blocked, you know, from that entitlement, right? The American dream. But how do we also understand the other dimensions of that, in which lots of families have those who are not testing well, and those are kind of quiet secrets that perhaps family members don't talk about. Right? Certainly, when families I know get together and the aunties are comparing who got into what school and all this kind of stuff, it's just so annoying and unbelievably, you know, it brings back trauma, right? That's my childhood trauma from all that stuff, and I'm sure it's reiterated time and time again. And not everybody gets into Harvard, not everybody gets, you know, to those places, but some of those discussions of intra-family differences and standards are, you know, but they seem to be also maybe little toeholds as you're all talking about organizing approaches. I'm wondering if that's apparent in any way in the work we're doing, or maybe other dimensions of intersectionality that come in that can be a way to kind of build some kind of language together.
You didn't meditate over it. So good.
Just go for it. I mean, there's no correct answer, but I think we're really, in some ways, because I really respect on-the-ground work with actual families and communities that you're dealing with, and how that's where we see all these differences. That's where we see those embarrassments. That's where we see those slippages. Not at the college level where people kind of achieved and attained a certain kind of smooth veneer of being able to get in and do well, right? Or they're on their way to Yale Law School or whatever school they're in. But then when people look back in the communities that they're coming from, it's much more complicated. So I'm just curious how that plays itself out.
Yeah, I'm kind of, so my Board of Education hat now for this question, because this is something that we look at a lot of times for disparities in student achievement. And so one of the approaches that our school district has taken to thinking about the needs of students is to look at what is commonly referred to as social and emotional learning as a component to, and a fundamental piece, you know, related to academic performance, right? So, you know, many people would, you know, would kind of dismiss social and emotional learning as a kind of you know, soft, foofy kind of, you know, emotional time that should be directed at learning reading, writing, and math skills, right? But what the research shows is that if students don't feel seen, if they don't feel heard, if they are being, you know, tracked and categorized, as you're indicating, along you know, systems of analysis that reduce their identity to a performance in a single test or their prior performance in another grade, then they will not be receptive to, they will not be able to access the education being offered to them. And so social and emotional learning is about seeing the whole student, right? And in some ways, I take what you're describing as a need to incorporate that, not only as a pedagogical tool, right, but also as a way for students to understand themselves as whole humans and not just that they are their performance, right? And which I think is, you know, among Asian Americans and immigrant communities, that idea of achievement is, you know, hangs, you know, so heavy on their heads that this is why we see high rates of suicide. and these are why we see high rates of burnout. And so by returning back to student needs and returning back to a kind of an approach that looks at every student deserves an education that can promote their thriving. And so in order to get there, though, we need to understand all of the things that have challenged that access. And so for schools to be able to get there, they need to have the resources for the counselors, for the professional development, like y'all are saying, that they also need teachers that look like that. And these are really, really hard problems to solve because they're very slow-moving systems. So, one of the things that I return to is Ocean Wong's work, who is a queer Vietnamese American refugee poet and writer who grew up in Hartford. And so, one of the things he talks about is that in some ways for what he saw as his own development in terms of that intergenerational kind of dialogue was that he kind of had to betray his parents' wishes for him to be invisible in order to survive, like we were talking about before, to play dead, essentially. And that we need to, he sees it as a betrayal of that wish for them to be okay by being invisible. And that's a really hard thing to hold, that betrayal. And it feels like providing those spaces for it not to just be a privately held kind of feeling can open up maybe other possibilities. So one of the first teacher preparation programs we did in Connecticut was with T. Bui's graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do, which is amazing. If you guys haven't seen it. Yes,
Yeah,
you have it right there. Yes. And it's an incredible text. And this provided so much amazing contact between teachers and their students in Connecticut because students read the title and knew it was about parents. And being able to, in the way that she paints it, in the way that to present parents as children was also like really transformational to kind of understand them as vulnerable and being shaped by history and trauma and conflict. That it opened up a channel of, of recognition of the self and the parent. So really special text. Really special.
Great, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex question, right? And I think to answer in short, right, we haven't been using the language of ableism in this context. It's a really interesting thought, though, and something that I'd like to think about more. And I think, like, when I think about the other parts of your question in terms of these intra-family differences, generational gaps, pressures, I think a lot about kind of what Jason was talking about, just mental health. And maybe this is too late, but content warning for like self-harm, suicide, etc. And something that I think is like very interesting, right, about the AAPI community is that among young AAPIs, suicide is the leading cause of death. And this is something that is true for no other racial group of this age, like no other. And it's kind of an interesting statistic, right, because I think in some ways it shows that we're actually doing a great job of protecting our young ones from certain forms of death, right, but not from suicide, not necessarily from mental health related issues. And I remember, and I'm sure like maybe a lot of us have stories like this. I remember like growing up, my parents like talking in whispers about the neighborhood kid who shot himself in the head because he didn't get into MIT, right? I think all of us probably have stories like this. And I think like what I think makes this question maybe so complicated as well is what Julia was talking about earlier when we're thinking about like class tensions and socioeconomic class, and how this idea of kind of like attaining higher socioeconomic class is so entangled with this idea of security as an immigrant. And I think very much in terms of like as an immigrant parent, what you want for your child. And what I think also is, sorry, I know this is a collection of somewhat scattered thoughts, but I think what I think is also interesting about this too is, so the community program that we've been talking about, the Asian American Leadership Program, in many ways, right, we market it to parents as a college readiness program, because that is how we get parents in the door. And in many ways, like maybe we're kind of pushing or kind of reiterating this really toxic narrative. But like what we try to do within the program, I think why we think it is so essential to also have this adult track of the program to bring parents and caregivers in the door is because we have them like sit down and actually have conversations with each other, right? We use restorative dialogue frameworks, a lot of areas from social emotional learning, but really trying to open up these conversations between parent and child that allow them to see each other as people, to allow them to see each other as kind of not just a collection of like fears about the future, right? But about like what they have the potential to do, what they have the potential to become, and how they can do it in a way that is healthy and gives joy and love. I don't know if I have too much more to say about that, but clearly I think, Jack, your question is pinging a lot of personal chords for us.
No, terrific responses. Thank you for sharing and being so open and willing to just go with all this. So why don't we open it up? We don't have a lot of time left. I'm not sure this is working, but let's open it up. And maybe we could pass one of the mics around. Or yeah, great, thank you.
Hello. Great. Thank you so much for for all that was said. I guess I have sort of nuts and bolts questions about how there's this opportunity now, right? Because of the political organizing and the efforts, there is an opportunity to with the mandate. And so the question here is, it seems like there's two issues, right? There's one is the issue of content, which there were these important philosophical questions about how to create content that's really reflective of the community that it's come from, and maybe doing it organically, and so forth. And then there's a question of delivery or its accessibility to the public schools, right? Because ultimately this is the goal, right? The goal is to get these histories, right? However we eventually develop it, define them, right? And then sort of getting it into the classroom. And traditionally the way it worked is that, these mostly terrible high school social studies textbooks contain these histories, right? Or don't, right? in this particular case, right? And so, so I have a few questions. The first one is, it seems like, Kathy, you were saying that the content is really not, doesn't seem like a huge, there seems to be a lot of material out there, is what you seem to be suggesting. So I guess my question is like, what are the biggest challenges for us to like realize the mandate and ensure that these histories are being taught in our schools? Is it content? Is it accessibility, and so forth? And part of the reason I'm asking this question is because there's a lot of people here who I think could be a resource. And I mean, I wonder sometimes, like, now that this mandate's happening, like, is there a role I can play here in terms of content?
Yes, there is.
Thanks, babe. So I guess my question is like, right, nuts and bolts questions, like the mandate's here now. What are the next steps that we need to take to ensure that the mandate is being fulfilled and these histories are being taught accurately by social studies teachers who currently do not have the resources and and the previous kind of education and wherewithal, particularly in a situation like New Jersey where there's no funding, which is interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, so I guess to clarify my earlier comment, so there are, so if you search, for example, like AAPI history lesson plans on Google, you will get a lot of results. So there's a lot of content out there. I would say, it's of like kind of varying quality, but there is pre-existing content out there. I think what the issue is, and this is an issue that I think is very kind of illustrative of a long-standing problem, maybe for the AAPI community, which is that we don't have really like large sustained sources of funding. And so what you get are these like kind of piecemeal people all over the place creating like varying lesson plans, often with like very little funding, not tied to standards, whether Common Core or like state curriculum standards. And so you just really get kind of like a hodgepodge. And so I think there's like a few problems with this, right? Number one is that consistently certain like narratives are left out. I think particularly Pacific Islander histories are left out again and again and again. There are very few lesson plans on Pacific Islander history that are out there currently available. And I think another big problem, right, is this idea, or like is this issue with like consistency. And so I know like Jason has talked about like wanting to create, or potentially wanting to create some kind of like model curriculum in Connecticut to help kind of alleviate some of these issues. And I know there are also institutions like the UCLA Asian American Studies Center that are creating things like the UCLA Asian American Studies digital Asian American Studies textbook, which is going to have something like 50 plus chapters with like a bunch of leading historians and author chapters, including K9. And so the idea behind the textbook is that we will have this collection of chapters as well as lesson plan modules. So IHI is working on some lesson plan modules with May, and to try to create kind of like a more, I would say, coherent system of teaching these histories. So I guess that is kind of my thought about the curriculum development. And your other question, maybe larger question about like the biggest challenges. To be honest, I would say the biggest challenge is probably not in content creation, although feel free to push back. I would say the biggest issue right now is about teacher buy-in and teacher training, because it takes much less resources when you think about it to like create a textbook or to create these like lesson plan modules, and it takes a lot of resources to be able to effectively train teachers. And so, for example, I know that the Asian American Education Project, they have some kind of pre-recorded or like kind of like mass like training sessions for educators, whereas IHI, we go on like a more like smaller boutique scale, right? We work like district by district directly with like in-person sessions with educators. And I think the idea is that we hope that the in-person sessions are more effective because it allows us to be able to generate the kind of teacher buy-in that is really necessary, especially with a teacher population that is so overwhelmingly like not representative of the student population. But the problem on like the flip side of that, right, is scaling. How do we scale this, especially when there is no funding? I think these are huge issues that we're still grappling with. And unfortunately, I don't have a good resolution.
I'll add is now we want to work with you. So I think like the UCLA digital textbook that Kathy mentioned. I think what feels really incredible is that there are all these academics, right, who are involved and who are writing, because as much as we tried, right, to kind of turn all those books into like digestible content, I think the historians probably can do it best themselves. I think we kind of create the pieces, right, that go along with the chapters or whatever. I will say, just like from the perspective of a lawyer, like K-12 education and the legal system that sort of stretches it is one big hot mess. And like lawyers' favorite answer for everything is it varies state by state, but for education, it truly varies state by state. So in New Jersey, the way like school needs to get buy-in, to get like schools to sign off on budgets, to get professional development, to buy lesson plans, to hire curriculum coaches, all of that, it depends on the school district, it depends on, right? So like sometimes our teachers are really excited, they bring it to their superintendent who is just like, oh no, we will never pay for this, right? Or the superintendent's like, great, whatever, like sign a check. And then we kind of have to slot ourselves into the existing curriculum design. Because I mean, schools have actually quite a structure for how to create their curriculum. And so whenever there's a mandate, and New Jersey, I think, is a state that loves to pass mandates, and like, a lot of teachers have said that they're very unhappy with the fact that there is another mandate because their curriculum is already so full. And so we have to like really work with them to like be like razor thin, sort of how to insert the curriculum here and here. And so Kathy and I did this, mostly Kathy, did this huge project with the school on how to bring like AAPI studies into the K-5 space, which is, there's almost nothing in the K-5 space. And so we had to like actually look at a school's curriculum, their calendar, we cited exact dates for when they would like teach this, and all of this work takes a tremendous amount of effort, and I think, you know, we've seen like analogous organizations who've done it better, because I think the API sort of discussion is just beginning, you know, like for example, for like Holocaust and genocide history, right, Basic History has this like very grassroots model, and they kind of utilize the teachers, but the sort of, I think the open question is, right, like at the end of the day, that model feels a little bit inconsistent, I think, with mandating and like enforcing, right, like laws that require teachings of certain topics. So I think right now it feels like everyone's doing like different ways to figure out what is the best way, which I'm sure is not actually very efficient, but I think, you know, like it feels like maybe having these different approaches, we might actually come to like a good one or a good several.
Yeah, Cornell, it's a great question. Content and delivery. I can say, you know, for us, we do have a longer time frame, right? So we're kind of, you know, we're taking this first year after the passage of the mandate to kind of assess what are some of our content goals, right? And to think about which communities need to be involved in order to get there. And to develop that, one of our activists in residence is JHD Jennifer Hakila Diaz, and you know she was an assistant principal in California. She's been a teacher, educator for a long time, and she's advocated for a teacher-centered approach to building curriculum that asks teachers to be involved in a long-term process. We've been working with. Last year we worked with teachers for 9 months. This year we're doing 2 cycles of 4-month engagements with teachers, and she calls them communities of practice, and it's about, you know, taking real-world classroom situations and plugging in this training and this understanding of Asian American studies and having them design things that work for them. And in that way, we kind of get at what y'all are saying, you know, which is that in Connecticut, it's a home rule state, which means that every district is its own kingdom. And they define how they meet state mandates on their own, right? So in fact, we do need to have teachers creating the curriculum, because if I do it, you know, with colleagues at UConn and I hand it out, it might work for a dozen, you know, districts. Otherwise, they might have to bring in more, you know, more translation or shift it in different ways. So in some ways, the process has to be decentralized and involve, you know, with stakeholders. And then the delivery part, the thing I've been focused on is really trying to impact the pipeline of teachers. So there are thousands of teachers that are currently teaching now, but there's a shortage of teachers. Right? The schools of education in all of our states are going to be producing new teachers, right, to meet that. And many young people do want to be teachers still, right? And it's important that we get into that process of educating future teachers now, so that we don't have to keep on doing what we're doing with bringing teachers up to speed, right? Can't go 0 to 60 in 3 years without touching the pipeline, right? Because you'll be doing that again the next 10 years. 10 years down the road, when those teachers retire, it's not a part of the teacher preparation system. We're going to be right back here again. So to me, that's a critical piece, is like we need to get out into schools, get teachers involved. We also need to change how teachers are being trained, because right now, 1990s multiculti stuff is still serving as the primary, sort of mechanism for training about non-white populations. And that's, we need to do more.
Is it okay? Okay.
This is kind of building on Cornell's point and your answers, and thank you all for your comments, and thank you for the work that you're doing, the really hard work that you're doing. I guess I have a sort of a content-related question and appreciating the insane federalism in education in this country, and district by district, and teacher buy-in and all those things. You know, as Kathy mentioned, you know, I'm one of the people that wrote a chapter for the UCLA project, and Kathy and Julia worked with me on the lesson plans, right? So we have a little bit of experience there, but that's just one chapter in 50 or more chapters. And it seems to me that it's a very kind of decentralized approach. It's going to be like this huge menu that anybody can choose chapters from. And I'm wondering, I mean, I'm not opposed to that, but I'm also wondering, like, you mentioned, Jason, this 90s multi-culti thing. I mean, do we have a master narrative? Should we? I mean, should we just have 50 chapters that any teacher could choose from? Or should we think about, you know, is there a master narrative? What should it be? I think one of the challenges in doing curriculum like this, it's also a challenge I've faced when I've worked on museum shows that are historical, is that you want to give an accurate history, one that is not just all feel good kind of thing, but you don't want it to be a total downer either, right? So you have, how do you balance that? How do you tell a story that's not too illogical? Like we were present and we got included, and everybody's somewhere on that continuum. That's not a narrative that I would promote. But then, you know, it's really hard to teach history as contingent, right? And as open-ended, and as uncertain in its future. So it's easy to teach the linear narrative, but if we don't believe in the linear narrative, how do we approach that question? So I think this is, to me, the really profound challenge. So I think it's, in some ways, it's not a bad solution in the short term to have 50 stories that teachers can choose from, but something in me feels that's not satisfied by that. And if we're going to have communities write their own stories, that's wonderful on one level, but it also doesn't answer that question. So anyway, so I'm going to put that to you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Just go on to the response.
I guess one inadequate response is I feel this very much in seeing the ways that we're doing this work to develop AAPI studies when there are parallel efforts going on to develop Black and Latino studies and Native American studies, LGBTQIA curriculum. And the way that we get our foot in the door is to be able to show up with a plan. And I think our first step is to really demonstrate that we can deliver on executing a plan, but then we need to revise in this sort of continuous improvement, that we need to come back and that this needs the conversation. So the way that people tell their stories involves other communities. That's something that we've seen over and over again, and that don't want to artificially divvy out those stories, So one of the things I've seen in the transformation of social studies standards are questions about, they're kind of like inquiry, driven questions instead of content-specific kinds of questions. About inquiry, how do you ask questions, right, specific, and that seemed to me to provide for not only that discovery, the possibility for discovery, but also that it becomes a classroom kind of project. And I think in that, to have a standard based on inquiry and not just on content, I think can help to get at some of those more aspirational senses of a shared humanity, shared civic life. I guess inadequate. I would keep thinking about that.
I hate to be blunt, but in an inquiry-based process, the teacher should have an opinion and an answer to the inquiry, right? And if the teacher has no answer, or not even a shape of an answer, then, you know, maybe I'm not getting the trends in education today, because, but.
This is a deep, ongoing conversation.
Yes.
That deals with future education and
right, yeah.
the state of all that training, which is in various ways, but
We have a hand raised over there.
I think Julie was going to say something.
yeah, unfortunately, we're at the very end of our time right now, so I just kind of want to respect that for the agreement. But I think some of these discussions can continue on for those who are staying a little longer, and maybe it's those of you who are having a meal together, so that'd be great.
I mean, one sort of a non-answer also to this question is, so I think as IHI, right, we have this mission that I think really focused on looking at migration, right, kind of key themes and stories. I think that we center, right, migration and migration policies and what their effects are. So I think for us, like, when we work with schools, I think we're very strategic about how to make it work, but I think that there are certain themes and narratives that we as an organization, right, believe that these case studies say. And I think one of the dangers of having just case studies, right, is I think exactly as you said, and a lot of schools have actually said this, is that, you know, there are certain case studies that can be taught and interpreted in different ways, and there are lessons that I think really retrench certain perceptions and harmful narratives. And I think, like, it's up to kind of both the school and the people who train the teachers, right, to kind of, I think there is some content-driven type of themes that we need to communicate. I think, to be honest with you, Meg, this is something that we think really, really struggle, because I think in some ways, when we work with teachers, they just want the case studies, right? And I think, like, some teachers, you know, get it. They, like, you know, are teaching it, and they, you know, they just want to incorporate more diverse content, right? And part of the things that they're already teaching in the classroom. And I think some teachers, I don't know, like, I think want more independence, right, with the case studies. So I don't know, even with that digital textbook, I'm not sure what the training that would look like, right? Or what are the overarching kind of sort of messages we want to be sending when we do those workshops.
Thank you all. Sorry we can't just continue at the end, but this also